Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the mist-draped, iron-gray fjords of 9th century Norway, where the salt wind carved the cliffs and the winter darkness swallowed the sun for months on end, the very idea of a single, unified kingdom was an alien, almost incomprehensible concept, a radical political fantasy that would have been dismissed as the idle daydream of a foolhardy youth by the scores of hard-bitten petty kings, jarls, and herdsir chieftains who ruled their ancestral domains with the fierce, untrammeled independence. That was the defining ethos of the Norse warrior aristocracy. The Norway that the young Harald Halfdanson was born into, around the year 850, was not a nation but a sprawling, fragmented archipelago of coastal settlements, deep-cut valleys, and isolated mountain plateaus, a geography that had, for centuries, militated against any project of centralization, carving the land into a mosaic of fiercely self-governing communities that were connected less by any sense of shared Norwegian identity than by the sea roads that linked them to the broader Viking world of the British Isles, the Frankish Empire, and the Baltic trade routes. Power in this fractured landscape was intensely local, rooted in the ownership of our land, the inalienable family estate that tied a chieftain to his ancestors and his gods, and the idea of surrendering one's ancestral autonomy to a distant, overmighty king was an affront to the core values of a culture that prized personal honor, family loyalty, and the right of a free man to walk away from any lord who failed to earn his respect. The Norwegian petty kingdoms, Vestfold, Hordaland, Rogaland, Son, Mor, Trondelag, Hålogaland, and a dozen others, were not stable territorial states with fixed borders and bureaucratic administrations. They were fluid, personal domains whose extent waxed and waned with the military prowess, the marital alliances, and the sheer luck of their rulers. And the history of the 8th and 9th centuries is a monotonous, blood-soaked chronicle of feuds, raids, and shifting coalitions that kept the Norwegian coast in a state of perpetual, low-grade warfare. Into this chaotic, warlord-dominated world, the Saga tradition places the young Harald, a prince of the Yngling dynasty, the ancient royal house that traced its ancestry back to the god Freyr himself, and whose power base was the rich, fertile district of Vestfold on the western shore of the Hafrsfjord, a region whose strategic location at the entrance to the Baltic trade routes, and whose agricultural wealth made it one of the most coveted prizes in the Norwegian chessboard. Harald's father, Halfdan the Black, was a successful and ambitious king who had already begun the process of consolidation, using a combination of strategic marriages, military conquest, and shrewd diplomacy to extend his rule over much of southeastern Norway, including the territories of Ringerike, Romerike, and Hadeland, and when Halfdan died around 860, drowned, according to the Sagas. When his horse and sleigh broke through the ice on the frozen Randsfjorden, the 10-year-old Harald inherited not only a substantial, though still modest, kingdom, but also the expectation that he would continue his father's expansionist project. The young king, who was placed under the regency of his maternal uncle, Guthorm, was, by all accounts, a precocious and fiercely determined child, a boy whose physical beauty, the Sagas describe him as tall, strong, and possessed of a magnificent head of yellow-gold hair that shone like silk in the sun, was matched by an iron will and a political intelligence that belied his years. And the early years of his reign were a brutal apprenticeship in the hard school of Viking statecraft, a succession of wars, betrayals, and assassinations that taught the young Harald the essential lesson that mercy, in the treacherous world of the Norwegian petty kingdoms, was a luxury that a king could not afford. The Norway that Harald was determined to conquer was a land of staggering physical majesty and appalling logistical difficulty, a 1,000-mile-long coastline of fjords, islands, and scary as that was, in the 9th century, the most densely populated region of Scandinavia. Its narrow strips of arable land wedged between the mountains and the sea supporting a population of perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 souls, a population that was scattered across thousands of isolated farmsteads and small coastal settlements that were accessible only by ship. The sea was the highway, the communication network, and the source of wealth for the Norwegian chieftains, whose longships, the sleek, shallow draft vessels that were the supreme technological achievement of the Viking Age, allowed them to project power along the entire length of the coast, to raid the rich monasteries and towns of the British Isles and the Frankish Empire, and to return, laden with silver, slaves, and prestige, to their home fjords. The control of the sea routes, the Norveg or the Northway, that gave the country its name, was the strategic key to the entire Norwegian coastline, and any king who aspired to unite the land would have to build a fleet that could dominate the maritime arteries of the coast and to seize the strategic choke points, the capes, the island passages, the sheltered harbors, that controlled the movement of ships and the flow of trade. The young Harald, who had inherited the fine ships and the experienced ship crews of his father, understood, with the instinct of a born strategist, that the war for Norway would be a war of fleets and sea battles, not of land campaigns and infantry maneuvers, and that the king who commanded the sea would command the land. The political culture of 9th century Norway, which was the raw material that Harald had to mold into a unified state, was a culture that was profoundly resistant to the centralizing impulses of monarchy, a culture in which the Thing, the assembly of free, weapon-bearing men that met at regular intervals to settle disputes, to make laws, and to elect or depose chieftains, was the fundamental institution of governance, and in which the authority of a king was strictly limited by custom, by the consent of the local freeholders, and by the ever-present threat of deposition or assassination. The Norse concept of kingship, which was rooted in the idea of the king as a konungur, a descendant of the gods who possessed a special hamingja, a luck or charisma that guaranteed victory and prosperity, was not a bureaucratic or territorial form of rule but a personal, charismatic form, and a king who failed to deliver victory, who lost his luck, or who violated the customary rights of the freeholders could be rapidly abandoned, his followers melting away to find a more successful leader, his kingdom dissolving back into its constituent chieftaincies. The project of unification, therefore, was not merely a military project, a matter of defeating rival kings on the battlefield, but a political and cultural revolution, an attempt to replace the old, decentralized, thing-based system of governance with a new, hierarchical system in which the king, and the king alone, was the source of law and the supreme lord of all the land. A revolution that would require not only the annihilation of the old aristocracy but the imposition of a new ideology of royal supremacy that was alien to the deep-rooted ethos of Norse freedom. The social and economic fabric of pre-unification Norway, which Harald Fairhair would eventually slice through with his sword and remake in his own image, was woven from the ancient, enduring threads of the Ett, the clan or extended family that was the fundamental unit of Norse society, a unit that provided the individual with his identity, his legal status, and his protection, and that demanded, in return, an absolute, unquestioning loyalty that frequently placed the bonds of kinship above the demands of any external political authority. The Norwegian farmstead, the gar, was the physical and economic nucleus of this clan-based society, a self-sufficient agricultural unit that was typically situated on a narrow strip of arable land at the head of a fjord or on a sheltered coastal plain, and that was worked by the extended family, their free servants, and in the wealthier households, a small number of slaves, the rlar, who were captured in Viking raids and who performed the most onerous and degrading labor of the farm. The economy of the farmstead was a mixed economy, combining the cultivation of barley, oats, and rye on the thin, stony soil with the husbandry of cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, the harvesting of the rich fisheries of the fjords and the outer sea, and the seasonal hunting of seal, walrus, and whale, a subsistence base that was, in all but the most fertile districts, barely sufficient to support the population, and that made the acquisition of supplementary wealth through raiding, trading, and the extraction of tribute an essential component of the chieftain's economic strategy. The chieftain, the herser or the jarl, was not, in this early period, a feudal landlord in the continental European sense. He was a primus inter pares, a first among equals, whose authority rested on his ability to protect his followers from external enemies, to distribute the loot of successful raids among his warband, and to preside over the sacrifices, the blot, that ensured the fertility of the land and the favor of the gods. The religious world of pre-Christian Norway, which the sagas depict with a nostalgic, elegiac tenderness, was a world of immanent, living gods who inhabited the landscape, the sacred groves, the waterfalls, and the burial mounds, a world in which Odin, the one-eyed Allfather, the god of war, wisdom, and poetry, who had sacrificed himself to himself on the world tree Yggdrasil to gain the knowledge of the runes, was the supreme deity of the aristocratic warrior elite, the patron of the berserkers and the skalds who sang the praises of dead kings. Thor, the red-bearded thunderer, the wielder of the hammer Mjolnir, the protector of Midgard against the chaotic forces of the giants, was the god of the common freeman, the farmer and the fisherman, who looked to Thor to protect his home and his crops from the elemental violence of the Norwegian climate, and whose hammer-shaped amulets, worn around the neck, were the most popular religious symbol of the Viking Age. A silent, defiant counterstatement to the Christian crosses that were beginning to appear on the necks of the new converts in the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon lands. The fertility gods, Freyr and Freya, the brother and sister deities of the Vanir, presided over the cycles of growth and reproduction that were the heartbeat of the agricultural year, and their cult, which involved the ritual marriage of a human representative of the god with a priestess, the Gyda, and the procession of a sacred wagon that carried the image of the god across the fields to bless the crops, was deeply rooted in the peasant communities of the Norwegian interior. This pagan religious system, which had no sacred scripture, no professional priesthood, and no central organizational structure, was a flexible, adaptive, and deeply local phenomenon, a cult of place and family that was inextricably intertwined with the land and the ancestors, and its very diffuseness made it a poor instrument for the legitimization of a centralized, supralocal monarchy of the kind that Harald Fairhair was attempting to construct. The technological foundations of Harald's eventual military success, the longships, the weapons, and the armor that were the material instruments of the Unification, were the products of a centuries-long tradition of maritime and metallurgical innovation that had transformed the Scandinavians from a peripheral, marginal people into the most feared and dynamic military force of the early medieval West. The Viking longship, the Longship, was a masterpiece of clinker-built carpentry, its overlapping oak planks fastened with iron rivets, its shallow draft allowing it to navigate the open ocean and the shallowest river equally well, its flexible hull absorbing the pounding of the waves rather than resisting it, and its single, square-rigged woolen sail, supplemented by the muscle power of rows of oarsmen, giving it a speed and a maneuverability that no other vessel of the age could match. The construction of a longship was a major communal enterprise, requiring the coordinated labor of skilled shipwrights, blacksmiths, and rope makers, and the finished vessel, with its elegantly curving stem and stern, its gilded weather vane, and its fearsome dragon-head prow that was intended to terrify the spirits of the land, was not merely a mode of transport but a symbol of the chieftain's power. A floating mead hall that carried his warriors across the whale road to glory and wealth. The weapons that the Viking warriors wielded, the double-edged sword, the broad-bladed axe, the iron-bossed shield, and the long, slender spear, were the tools of a warrior culture that had elevated combat to a sacred art, and the skilled smiths who forged the pattern-welded blades of the finest swords, their surfaces swirling with the intricate, serpentine patterns of twisted iron and steel, were revered figures. Their craft a quasi-magical operation that was hedged with rituals and taboos. The intellectual and artistic culture of 9th century Norway, the culture of the skalds and the rune carvers, of the Uller, the wise men who recited the ancient genealogies and the sacred lore of the gods at the feasts and the sacrifices, was an oral culture, a culture in which the spoken word, the alliterative verse, and the intricate metaphor-dense kenning were the highest forms of art and the most potent instruments of social memory. The skald, the court poet who composed and recited the praise poems, the draper, that immortalized the deeds of a king or a chieftain, was a figure of immense prestige and political importance, because the poem he composed, if it was good, would be repeated in the halls of the powerful for generations after its subject was dead, ensuring that the warrior's orchestra, his word glory, would survive the dissolution of his body and the decay of his grave mound. The runes, the angular script that was carved on wood, bone, and stone, were not, in the pre-Christian period, a medium for the recording of long, continuous texts but a tool for the inscription of names, memorials, and magical formulas, the visible, permanent trace of the spoken word that gave the dead a presence in the landscape and that reminded the living of their obligations to the ancestors. The Norway that Harald Fairhair set out to conquer was, therefore, not a simple, barbarian wilderness but a complex, sophisticated society, a society that possessed a rich material culture, a refined poetic tradition, and a deeply rooted legal and political system, a society that would not be easily or willingly subordinated to the will of a single, overmighty king. The Yngling dynasty into which Harald Fairhair was born, and which the later medieval genealogists would celebrate as the divine, Odin-descended royal line that had ruled the north since the mists of the mythic past, was, in the sober judgment of modern historians, a somewhat less exalted but nonetheless formidable political lineage, a family of astute and ruthless warlords who had, over the course of the 8th and early 9th centuries, carved out a substantial power base in the fertile, strategically located region of Vestfold, on the western coast of the Hafrsfjord, a region whose control of the entrance to the great fjord and whose access to the rich agricultural lands of the interior gave it an economic and military weight that was disproportionate to its modest geographical extent. The Yngling kings, whose genealogy is preserved in the 9th century skaldic poem Ynglingadal, composed by the poet Jarl of Viner for a predecessor of Harald, trace their lineage back through a chain of semi-legendary Swedish and Norwegian rulers to the god Freyr, the Vanir deity of fertility and kingship, a genealogy that was, for the pre-Christian Norse, the ultimate charter of royal legitimacy. A claim that the Konungur was not merely a successful warlord but a being of a different, more potent ontological order, a descendant of the gods whose body and whose luck were vessels of the divine power that ensured the prosperity of the land and the victory of the army. The historical reality that lies behind the mythological genealogy is, of course, impossible to recover in any detail, but the Yngling dynasty was, by the middle of the 9th century, a formidable political force, its power firmly established in Vestfold and extending, through a network of marriages and tributary relationships, into the neighboring districts of Ringerike, Romerike, and Hedeland, the rich, forested interior regions that were the economic heartland of eastern Norway. Harald's father, Halfdan the Black, whose reign is conventionally dated to the years 830–860, is a figure who occupies the shadowy, transitional zone between the semi-legendary Yngling ancestors and the fully historical Harald, a king whose existence is independently attested by the skaldic poetry and the later Saga tradition, but whose deeds, as recorded in the Heimskringla, are so heavily encrusted with folktale motifs and political propaganda that the historical man is difficult to discern beneath the layers of myth. According to Snorri Sturluson, Halfdan was a wise and benevolent king, a lawgiver who organized the things and who was beloved by his people for his justice and his good his bountiful harvests, a portrait that is clearly designed to present the father of the unifier as a model of the ideal, proto-Christian monarch, a Solomon of the north who prepared the way for his greater son. The historical Halfdan, who was probably a more conventional Viking chieftain, was responsible for a significant expansion of the Yngling domain, pushing the frontier of the kingdom northward and westward through a combination of military conquest and political marriage, and the Saga's account of his death, drowned, as we have noted, when his horse-drawn sleigh plunged through the ice of the Randsfjorden in the winter of 860, is a story that, whatever its factual accuracy, encapsulates the ever-present danger of the Norwegian winter, the thin, treacherous boundary between life and death that was the constant companion of the medieval northerner. The body of Halfdan, according to Snorri, was so beloved by the different regions of his kingdom that the leading men of Ringerike, Romerike, Hedeland, and Vestfold each demanded a share of the royal corpse to bury in their own district, a macabre relic cult that ended only when the disputing parties agreed to quarter the body and to erect a burial mound in each region, a story that, whether true or apocryphal, is a powerful symbol of the centrifugal forces that were constantly threatening to pull the infant kingdom apart and that Harald, the son and heir, would have to master if he were to avoid his father's fate. The early years of Harald's reign, which began when he was a mere boy of 10 years old, were a period of intense crisis and brutal political education, a time when the fragile edifice that Halfdan had constructed was threatened, from both within and without, by the jealous rivalries of the Norwegian chieftains and the predatory ambitions of the neighboring Swedish and Danish kings. And when the survival of the young king depended entirely on the skill and the loyalty of his uncle Guthorm, who acted as regent and commander of the royal army. Snorri recounts a series of campaigns that Guthorm waged on the young Harald's behalf, campaigns that were designed to punish the rebel chieftains who had seized the opportunity of Halfdan's death to reassert their independence and to expand the borders of the kingdom into the rich, contested territories of the interior. And the Saga's narrative of these years, though compressed and simplified, preserves the memory of a desperate, grinding struggle, a war of attrition against the hydra-headed enemy that seemed to sprout a new rebellion for every one that was crushed. The young Harald, who was no sheltered, palace-bred princeling but an active participant in the campaigns from his earliest teenage years, learned, in the crucible of this perpetual warfare, the essential lessons of Viking statecraft, that enemies must be annihilated, not merely defeated, that the oaths of the conquered, sworn on the holy ring of Thor, were worthless unless they were backed by the permanent presence of a royal garrison, and that the only foundation of political power was the absolute, unquestioning loyalty of a well-rewarded warband, a herd of professional warriors who were bound to the king by ties of personal oath and material self-interest. The political geography of Harald's early kingdom, which Snorri describes with the precision of a 13th century Icelander who had studied the Norwegian landscape, was centered on the Hafrsfjord and the rich, forested uplands of the interior, a region that the Sagas call Vik, the Great Bay, a term that encompassed the modern districts of Vestfold, Ostfold, and the lands around the modern city of Oslo. And that was, in the 9th century, the most densely populated and the most economically developed zone of Norway, a region that was in constant contact with the Danish and Swedish kingdoms across the Skagerrak and the Baltic, and that was, consequently, more exposed to the cultural and political influences of the wider European world than the isolated fjords of the western coast. From this secure eastern base, the young Harald, now approaching manhood, could survey the vast, unconquered expanse of the Norwegian coastline, the hundreds of miles of fjords and islands that stretched northward and westward to the frozen wastes of Hålogaland, the land of the Sami, and could begin to plan the campaign that would make him, in the words that Gyda had spoken to his messenger, the king of all Norway, as King Eirik of Uppsala rules over Sweden and King Gorm over Denmark. The ambition was staggering, the obstacles immense, and the odds of success, in the judgment of any rational observer, were vanishingly small. But the young Harald, who had been raised in a culture that believed that fate was fixed, that the Norns had already spun the thread of every man's life, and that the only choice was the manner of one's death, was not a man who was susceptible to the counsels of prudence. The legend of Gyda's rejection, which Snorri Sturluson presents as the catalytic moment that launched the entire Unification project, is a story of such perfect narrative symmetry, such fairy tale elegance, that the skeptical modern historian is compelled, almost by professional reflex, to doubt its literal truth, yet the very perfection of the story, its deep resonance with the folktale motifs of the proud princess, and the unpromising suitor who achieves the impossible, is a clue to its profound symbolic significance, a significance that transcends the question of whether the specific conversation between Harald's emissaries and the daughter of King Eirik of Hordaland ever actually occurred. According to the Heimskringla, the adolescent Harald, who had already begun to consolidate his power in the east and who was looking to expand his influence through a marriage alliance with one of the powerful kingdoms of the western coast, sent his messengers to Gyda, the daughter of King Eirik of Hordaland, a region that encompassed the modern city of Bergen and the surrounding fjords. And that was one of the most prosperous and strategically significant of the western Norwegian kingdoms. Gyda, who was, by all accounts, a woman of exceptional beauty, intelligence, and pride, listened to the emissary's proposal and then delivered the devastating riposte that has echoed through the halls of Scandinavian history ever since. She would not marry a king who ruled only a few petty districts. Let Harald first make himself the master of all Norway. As King Eirik of Uppsala was master of Sweden and King Gorm was master of Denmark, and then she would consider becoming his queen. The emissaries, stunned by the audacity of the reply, returned to Harald and urged him to punish the insolent princess by seizing her by force. But the young king, in a moment of political genius, recognized that Gyda had given him a gift far more valuable than a marriage alliance, a public, compelling narrative that would justify his wars of conquest and that would transform a sordid, self-interested campaign of territorial aggrandizement into a romantic quest for a worthy bride. The vow that Harald swore in the wake of Gyda's rejection, the oath that he would neither cut nor comb his hair until he had united all Norway under his sole rule, is, in its sheer physicality and its visual symbolism, one of the most brilliant acts of political theater in the history of the early Middle Ages, an oath that transformed the king's own body, his most immediate and personal possession, into a walking, living monument to his ambition, a permanent, visible reminder to his followers and his enemies that the king's will was fixed and that his resolve was unbreakable. The unkempt, tangled mane that grew from Harald's head over the course of the decade-long Unification campaign was not a mere personal eccentricity but a carefully managed piece of political propaganda, a signal to the Norse aristocracy that the king had placed himself in a liminal, transitional state, a state of suspended identity, and that he would not resume his normal, civilized appearance until the task was complete and the land was his. The nickname Harald Lufa, Harald the Shock Haired or Harald the Tangled Hair, which was bestowed on him during these years, is a testament to the effectiveness of this propaganda, a name that was repeated in the halls of his enemies and that reminded every man who heard it that the king of Vestfold was not a man who made idle threats. The parallel between Harald's hair vow and the vows of the Old Testament Nazarites, who swore not to cut their hair as a sign of their dedication to God, is one that has been noted by historians of religion, and while there is no evidence of direct biblical influence on the pagan Harald, the archetypal power of the uncut hair as a symbol of sacred, focused power is a human universal that transcends specific cultural contexts. The marriage that eventually followed the fulfillment of the vow, after the Battle of Hafrsfjord, was not, however, a marriage to Gyda, who disappears from the Saga narrative after her initial rejection and whose ultimate fate is unknown, but a complex series of marital alliances that were the essential diplomatic infrastructure of the Unification project. A web of unions that bound the Yngling dynasty to the most powerful families of the conquered territories and that helped to secure the loyalty of the defeated chieftains. Snorri relates that Harald, after his victory at Hafrsfjord, married a succession of wives from different regions of Norway, including Ragnhild the Mighty, the daughter of King Eirik of Jutland, who bore him his favorite son, Eirik Bloodaxe, and Svanhild, the daughter of the powerful Jarl Eystein, who bore him the sons who would eventually contest the succession, Olaf, Bjorn, and Ragnar. And the result of these multiple unions was a vast, unruly brood of sons, the Harald Signer, who would, after their father's death, plunge the kingdom into a civil war that would last for generations. The historical Gyda, if she existed, was probably the daughter of a powerful Hordaland chieftain, and her rejection of Harald, if it occurred, was a calculated political insult, a declaration that the Yngling upstart from the east was not worthy of an alliance with the proud Western aristocracy, an insult that Harald, with his vow, brilliantly transformed from a humiliation into a casus belli, a justification for the wars that would eventually shatter that same aristocracy. The folkloric and literary dimensions of the Gyda story, which have been exhaustively analyzed by the scholars of Old Norse literature, reveal a deep structure that is common to many Indo-European heroic traditions: the unpromising hero, the disdainful princess, the impossible task, and the eventual fulfillment that transforms the hero into a king and the princess, if she is lucky, into a queen. A structure that is found in the tales of the Greek Heracles, the Irish Cuchulainn, and the Indian Arjuna, and that speaks to a fundamental human pattern of the heroic biography. The saga writer, who was composing his narrative in the 13th century, over 3 centuries after the events he describes, was not a modern historian, concerned with the accurate reconstruction of the past, but a literary artist, a master of the prose saga, who selected, arranged, and embellished his material to create a compelling, morally coherent story that would entertain and edify his audience. And the Gyda episode, whatever its historical basis, is a masterpiece of saga art, a moment of high drama that perfectly captures the character of the young Harald and the epic scale of his ambition. The historical Harald, the flesh and blood king of the 9th century, almost certainly did not launch the Unification campaign because of a woman's scorn. He launched it because he was an ambitious, power-hungry warlord, the heir of a dynasty that had been expanding for generations, and the unification of Norway, whatever its romantic justifications, was a brutal, calculated project of political centralization that was driven by the same motives, the desire for power, wealth, and security, that drove every other conqueror in the long, bloody history of the early medieval world. The military campaigns that Harald Fairhair waged between his accession around 860 and the climactic Battle of Hafrsfjord, conventionally dated to 872, were a series of interconnected, strategically coordinated offensives that, over the course of a decade of grinding, attritional warfare, systematically dismantled the old order of the Norwegian petty kingdoms and replaced it with a new, centralized monarchy, a process that was, in its deliberate, inexorable progression, a model of strategic planning and political ruthlessness that has few parallels in the military history of the early Middle Ages. The Sagas, particularly Snorri's Heimskringla, provide a detailed, though chronologically unreliable and heavily legendary, account of these campaigns, an account that can be supplemented and corrected by the evidence of the contemporary skaldic poetry, the praise poems that were composed for Harald by his court poets and that preserve, in their intricate, metaphorical language, the memory of specific battles, specific enemies, and specific victories, a memory that, because it was transmitted orally and in verse, was less susceptible to the radical distortions that affected the later prose narratives. The skaldic poem Haraldsvi, composed by the poet Orbjørn Hornklofi, is the most important of these contemporary sources, a magnificent, alliterative ode that celebrates Harald's victories and that provides a vivid, if stylized, portrait of the king and his warriors, a portrait that is probably the closest we can get to the historical Harald, a portrait of a king who is both a generous ring-giver, a patron of poets, and a ruthless, implacable foe whose enemies are crushed beneath the weight of his hamingja, his royal luck. The strategic logic of Harald's campaigns, which Snorri describes in some detail, was a logic of sequential, cumulative conquest, a step-by-step advance from the Yngling power base in the southeast to the farthest fjords of the west and the north, a strategy that was designed to prevent the formation of a grand coalition of the petty kings against him by defeating them one by one, isolating each kingdom before it could make common cause with its neighbors. The first phase of the campaign, which occupied the early 860s, was directed against the interior districts of the east, the forested uplands of Uppland, Hedmark, and Gudbrandsdal, the regions that had been the traditional allies and tributaries of the Yngling dynasty and that were the economic heartland of eastern Norway, a region of rich farms, fine timber, and a dense population of freeholders who could be mobilized for the royal army. The conquest of the interior was achieved through a combination of pitched battles, sieges of the hill forts that were the last refuges of the rebel chieftains, and most importantly, the systematic imposition of a new system of royal administration, the Viesler or royal estates, a network of farms that were confiscated from the defeated chieftains and that were distributed among Harald's loyal followers, who were required, in return, to provide military service and to administer the surrounding districts in the king's name. The Viesler system, which was the administrative backbone of the Haraldian monarchy, was a revolutionary innovation in Norwegian governance, a transformation of the old, personal, clan-based authority of the chieftains into a new, territorial, royal authority that was backed by the permanent presence of a royal steward and the constant threat of a royal army. The second phase of the campaign, which occupied the mid-860s, was the advance along the western coast, the conquest of the powerful maritime kingdoms of Rogaland, Hordaland, and Son, the regions that were the heartland of the old Norwegian aristocracy, the home of the greatest chieftains and the most formidable fleets, and the center of the resistance to Harald's centralizing project. The western chieftains, who had watched the Yngling advance from the east with growing alarm, assembled a series of coalitions to resist Harald's encroachment, and the sagas record a succession of large-scale naval battles in the fjords and the island passages of the western coast, battles in which the longships of the rival fleets clashed in the narrow waters, their crews exchanging volleys of arrows, spears, and stones before grappling and boarding, the outcome decided by the ferocity of the individual warriors and the tactical skill of the rival commanders. Harald, who had built a fleet that was larger and more experienced than any of the Western coalitions, was able to defeat each coalition in turn, exploiting the endemic rivalries among the chieftains to prevent them from uniting into a single, overwhelming force, and the defeat of the Western kingdoms, which was sealed by the capture of the great chieftain strongholds on the islands of Karmøy, the sacred island of the Rogaland kings, and on the fertile plains of Jæren, opened the way to the far north and the final, decisive confrontation at Hafrsfjord. The third phase of the campaign, which unfolded in the late 860s and early 870s, was the push into the far northern regions of Møre, Trøndelag, and Hålogaland, the land of the midnight sun and the Sami, a vast, thinly populated zone of deep fjords, towering mountains, and Arctic tundra that was the most remote and the most culturally distinct region of the Norwegian coastline. A region whose chieftains, the Halagjarlar, the Jarls of Hålogaland, were a semi-independent dynasty of sea kings who had grown rich on the fur trade, the walrus ivory, and the tribute of the Sami. The conquest of the north was a logistical and military challenge of a different order from the conquest of the west, because the distances were immense, the population was scattered, and the environment, with its ferocious winter storms and its months of perpetual darkness, was hostile to military operations. But Harald, who had learned the lessons of the earlier campaigns, employed a combination of naval power, political bribery, and the strategic marriage that was his favorite instrument of pacification, a marriage to Svanhild, the daughter of the powerful Jarl Eystein of Møre, a union that brought the northern chieftains into a personal, dynastic relationship with the Yngling crown and that ensured their cooperation in the final campaign against the last, desperate holdouts of the old order. By the summer of 872, the only unconquered territories of any significance were the far southwestern region of Agder and the adjacent kingdom of Rogaland, whose chieftains, led by the formidable Kjav the Rich, had assembled a final, desperate coalition, a fleet of longships that gathered in the sheltered waters of Hafrsfjord, a narrow, fjord-like bay on the coast of modern Stavanger, to make a last stand against the Yngling onslaught. The political economy of Harald's unification, the fiscal and administrative machinery that he constructed to extract the resources that financed the campaign, was as important to his success as the military prowess of his warriors, because the maintenance of a standing fleet and a professional army, the construction of the royal estates, and the payment of the herd warriors who were the backbone of the royal power required a steady, reliable flow of revenue, a flow that could not be sustained by the intermittent, unpredictable booty of raiding. Harald's solution to this fiscal challenge was the imposition of a new system of taxation, the landskild, a land tax that was levied on every farm in the kingdom and that was paid in kind, in grain, in livestock, in fish, and in the silver that was the universal medium of exchange in the Viking world, a tax that was collected by the royal stewards, the Armen, who were posted at the Visler, and who were responsible for the economic administration of their districts. The imposition of the landskild, which was a direct violation of the traditional rights of the freeholders, who had never been required to pay a regular, fixed tax to a central authority, was the most unpopular and the most revolutionary aspect of Harald's centralization, a policy that alienated the very class of free farmers who were supposed to be the foundation of his power and that, more than any other factor, fueled the emigration to Iceland and the Atlantic islands that would, in the long run, be the most enduring legacy of Harald's reign. The Battle of Hafrsfjord, the climactic, ship-to-ship engagement that Snorri Sturluson and the Skaldic poets present as the decisive turning point of the unification, the moment when the old, fragmented order of the Norwegian petty kingdoms was shattered and the new, centralized monarchy of Harald Fairhair was born, was, by any measure, one of the largest and most consequential naval battles of the early Viking Age. A battle that involved, according to the Saga accounts, the fleets of all the remaining independent chieftains of the western coast, a coalition that was assembled by the wealthy and powerful King Kjav the Rich of Agder, and that included the forces of King Sulk of Rogaland, King Eirik of Hordaland, and a host of lesser jarls and Hersir who had fled from the conquered territories and had gathered their remaining ships and warriors for a final, desperate throw of the dice. The site of the battle, the Hafrsfjord, is a long, narrow inlet on the coast of Rogaland, a sheltered body of water that is connected to the open sea by a narrow, easily defensible entrance, and that is surrounded by low, rolling hills from which the local population could, in the centuries that followed, gaze down upon the waters where their ancestors had fought and died, a landscape that has been saturated for over a millennium with the memory of the great battle that gave birth to the Norwegian nation. The date of the battle, which the later Icelandic historians placed in the year 872, has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, with some modern historians pointing to the chronologies of the Irish annals and the archaeological evidence of the Norwegian royal centers, arguing for a slightly later date, perhaps in the 880s, a debate that, while important for the fine-grained reconstruction of the Viking Age chronology, does not alter the fundamental historical reality of the battle, or its significance as the symbolic and military end of the unification process. The opposing fleets that clashed in the waters of Hafrsfjord on that long-ago summer day were, in their composition and their tactical capabilities, a microcosm of the two Norways that were struggling for dominance. On the one side, the coalition of the Western chieftains, the old aristocracy, whose ships, the finest products of the Norwegian shipwrights' art, were crewed by the freeborn Bondi warriors. The farmers and the fishermen who owed their loyalty to their local chieftain and who fought in the traditional manner, as individuals, their prowess and their honor the measure of their worth. On the other side, the fleet of Harald Fairhair, a fleet that had been assembled from the conquered territories, a fleet of ships that were crewed by the king's professional herd warriors, the berserkers and the Lfener, the wolf-skinned, the elite shock troops who fought in a disciplined, coordinated fashion, their individual prowess subordinated to the tactical needs of the king's battle plan. The sagas emphasize the presence of the berserkers in Harald's fleet, the warriors who fought in a state of sacred, shamanistic frenzy, who bit their shields, howled like wolves, and were, according to the belief of the age, impervious to fire and iron, a belief that, whatever its objective truth, had a profound psychological effect on the opposing forces, who saw the berserkers as instruments of Odin, the god of war, and who trembled at their approach. The poet Orbjörn Hornklofi, in his Haraldskvi, describes the berserkers in a vivid, memorable passage that has become one of the most quoted lines in the entire corpus of Old Norse poetry. The berserkers roared, the battle was in full swing, the wolf-skinned warriors shook their spears, the swords clashed, the shields were shattered, the ravens waded in the blood of the slain. The tactical dynamics of the battle, which can be reconstructed, in broad outline, from the skaldic poetry and the sagas, were the dynamics of a classic Viking naval engagement, a battle in which the opposing fleets, having located each other in the narrow waters of the fjord, formed a line of battle, their ships lashed together side by side to create a floating platform. A wooden battlefield on which the warriors could advance and retreat, and on which the outcome would be decided by the weight of numbers, the ferocity of the individual warriors, and the tactical skill of the rival commanders. The sagas relate that the battle began with a prolonged exchange of missile fire, the archers and the spear throwers on both sides raining a deadly hail of arrows and javelins upon the opposing ships, a phase of the engagement that was designed to thin the ranks of the enemy and to create gaps in the shield wall that could be exploited by the shock troops who would lead the boarding assault. Harald, who had positioned his flagship, the great dragon ship that was the pride of his fleet, in the center of the line, directed the assault against the flagship of King Gyda, the focal point of the enemy coalition, and the Haraldskvi celebrates the personal bravery of the king, who, according to the poet, flung his shield aside, raised his sword, and waded into the thickest press of the enemy. A portrait of royal heroism that may be, in part, a poetic convention, but that reflects the expectations of the Norse warrior culture, which required a king, whatever his tactical responsibilities, to demonstrate his personal courage in the sight of his warriors. The death of King Gyda the Rich, which the sagas describe in a stark, memorable passage, was the decisive moment of the battle, the event that broke the spirit of the coalition and that transformed a closely fought engagement into a rout. According to Snorri, Gyda, seeing that the battle was lost and that his fleet was being overwhelmed, fled from the battle, leaping from his ship and escaping to the shore, where he disappeared into the mountains, a broken, defeated man, his wealth, his power, and his kingdom stripped from him by the relentless Ingling conqueror. The flight of Fjord was the signal for the general collapse of the coalition, and the surviving chieftains, their ships shattered, their warriors slaughtered, their hopes destroyed, made their peace with Harald on whatever terms they could obtain, some surrendering and accepting the status of royal vassals, others fleeing into exile, taking their families, their portable wealth, and their followers and sailing across the North Sea to the islands that would become the refuges of the independent Norse spirit, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Faroes, and eventually, the empty, volcanic island of Iceland, where they would build a new society, a society without a king, a society that was, in its institutions and its ethos, a deliberate, self-conscious rejection of the centralized monarchy that Harald had imposed on their homeland. The Battle of Hafrsfjord, which the Norwegians still celebrate as the foundational event of their national history, was, in this sense, a battle that created not only a new nation but a new diaspora, a scattering of the Norse people across the North Atlantic that would have consequences that Harald, in his moment of triumph, could never have imagined. The aftermath of the battle, which the Sagas describe with a mixture of grim satisfaction and elegiac melancholy, was a scene of the standard, horrific detritus of a Viking Age engagement. The waters of the fjord clogged with the wreckage of the shattered ships, the bodies of the slain warriors floating in the red-tinted water, the survivors, the wounded and the captured, huddled on the decks of the victorious ships, awaiting the judgment of the conqueror. Harald, who was not a man who was given to unnecessary cruelty, but who was also not a man who was foolish enough to leave a defeated enemy alive to plot his revenge, offered the surviving chieftains the choice that was the standard ultimatum of the medieval conqueror: submission or death. Most of the survivors chose submission, accepting baptism, if the sagas are to be believed, and swearing the oaths of loyalty that bound them to the Ingling crown, but a significant minority, the proudest and the most independent of the old aristocracy, chose exile, taking their ships and their followers and sailing away from the land that had been their home for centuries, a choice that would, in the long run, create the Icelandic Commonwealth and the Norse settlements of the North Atlantic. The most enduring and the most culturally significant legacy of Harald Fairhair's unification. The immediate political settlement that Harald Fairhair imposed upon Norway in the wake of his victory at Hafrsfjord was a revolutionary restructuring of the very foundations of Norwegian governance, a settlement that swept away the ancient, clan-based system of the petty kingdoms and replaced it with a new, hierarchical, and territorially defined administrative apparatus that was, in its essence, an instrument of royal absolutism, a system that was designed to extract the maximum revenue from the conquered territories and to suppress, through the permanent presence of royal officials, the ever-present threat of rebellion. The old chieftains, the Hersir and the Jarlar, who had been the independent rulers of their ancestral districts, were not, for the most part, exterminated, a policy that would have been both logistically impossible and politically counterproductive, but were transformed, through the forced acceptance of royal grants and the swearing of binding oaths of loyalty, into a new class of royal office holders, the lendermen, the landed men, who held their lands not as independent, allodial possessions but as fiefs from the king, a revolutionary change in the legal status of the land that was, in the long run, the most important institutional legacy of Harald's reign. The lendermar, who was typically a former chieftain who had been co-opted into the royal administration, was required to maintain a fixed number of armed men, to collect the royal taxes in his district, and to lead the local levy, the leanger, in time of war, and his authority, which had formerly been a matter of personal, inherited charisma, was now a matter of royal appointment, revocable at the king's pleasure. A transformation that fundamentally altered the nature of political power in the Norwegian countryside. The royal estate system, the Viesler, which Harald had begun to establish during the Unification campaigns, was expanded and systematized in the years after Hafrsfjord, creating a network of royal farms that were scattered across the entire length of the Norwegian coast, from the Óðalfjord to the far north of Hålogaland, a network that served as the physical infrastructure of the new monarchy. The places where the king and his retinue could reside during their constant, peripatetic journeys through the kingdom, the Vaisla circuit that was the primary mechanism of royal governance in the early medieval North. The king, in the Haraldian system, was not a sedentary monarch, a figure who sat on a throne in a fixed capital and issued decrees to distant subordinates. He was an itinerant king, a king who traveled, with his herd of warriors and his court of poets and priests, from one royal estate to the next, consuming the produce of the estate, dispensing justice in the local things, and making his physical presence felt in every corner of his realm, a system of governance that was, in its personal, face-to-face character, a continuation of the old, charismatic style of Norse kingship, but that was now, for the first time, backed by a permanent administrative infrastructure and a standing army that could punish any district that dared to withhold its taxes or its loyalty. The royal estate at Avaldsnes, on the island of Karmøy on the western coast, which was, according to Snorri, Harald's favorite residence and the place where he died and was buried, was the center of this network, a sprawling complex of halls, storehouses, and boathouses that commanded the strategic entrance to the Karmsund, the narrow channel that was the main shipping route along the western coast, a location that was, in its control of the sea roads, the perfect symbol of the maritime basis of Harald's power. The imposition of a uniform system of law across the newly unified kingdom, a system that was based, in part, on the ancient, customary law of the Gyðing in the west and the Frostathing in the north, but that was modified and supplemented by the new, royal legislation that was promulgated by Harald and his council of advisors, was the third pillar of the post-Hafrsfjord settlement. A legal revolution that was designed to replace the fragmented, local legal traditions of the petty kingdoms, with a single, coherent body of law that was the king's law, a law that applied to every man in the realm, regardless of his regional origin or his former political allegiance. The Sagas credit Harald with the establishment of the Gyðing law code, the great legal compilation that was recited, from memory, by the Lagskimmer, the law speaker, at the annual assembly of the western districts, a body of law that covered every aspect of the freeman's life, the penalties for theft, murder, and adultery, the rules of inheritance and land tenure, the procedures for the settlement of disputes, and the conduct of the thing, and that was enforced by the king's officials, the Armen, who were empowered to prosecute offenders and to collect the fines that were an important source of royal revenue. The role of the king as the supreme lawgiver, the Lagosmer, the maker of the law, was a radical departure from the Old Norse tradition, which held that the law was an ancient, unchanging custom that could not be altered by any human authority, and the acceptance of the king's right to legislate, to create new laws and to modify old ones, was a fundamental shift in the political culture of Norway, a shift that was, in its essence, the acceptance of the king as a sovereign, a ruler whose authority was not limited by the customs of the thing but was, in the final analysis, absolute. The religious dimension of Harald's centralization, which is often overlooked in the secular, political focus of the sagas, was an important component of the Unification project, because the king, as the descendant of the god Freyr and the supreme intermediary between the human community and the divine powers, was the natural head of the pagan cult, the chief priest of the national religion. A position that gave him a potent, supernatural sanction for his political authority and that allowed him to co-opt the religious loyalties of the population in the service of the state. Harald, according to the sagas, was a devout pagan, a regular participant in the great sacrificial feasts, the blot, that were held at the major cult centers of the kingdom, at Maer in Trondelag, at Lidra in Denmark, at Uppsala in Sweden, and his patronage of the temples and the priests, the Gore, was a central aspect of his royal policy, a policy that was designed to ensure that the gods, who were the ultimate guarantors of the king's luck and the kingdom's prosperity, remained favorably disposed to the Yngling dynasty. The conversion of Norway to Christianity, which began in earnest during the reign of Harald's son Hakon the Good in the mid-10th century and which was completed, with considerable violence, by King Olaf Haraldsson, Street Olaf, in the early 11th century, was, in a sense, the logical continuation of the centralizing, state-building project that Harald had initiated. Because the Christian religion, with its hierarchical, episcopal organization, its literate, Latin-based culture, and its ideology of the king as the anointed Christ-like ruler, was a far more effective instrument of royal absolutism than the diffuse, decentralized, and tradition-bound pagan cult could ever be. The long-term consequences of Harald's administrative innovations, which were refined and extended by his successors in the 10th and 11th centuries, were the creation of a unified Norwegian state that, despite the civil wars that erupted periodically over the succession to the throne, would endure as a permanent, institutional reality for the remainder of the Middle Ages and beyond, a state that was, by the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, one of the most centralized and most effectively governed kingdoms in Europe, a kingdom whose administrative structure, the Sicel system of royal officials and the Leangerfleet levy, was the direct descendant of the Viesler and the Lendermen that Harald had established. The Harald who emerges from this administrative history is not the romantic, shock-haired youth of the Gyda legend but a hard-headed, calculating politician, a man who understood that the conquest of a kingdom was only the first, and the easiest, part of the task, and that the permanent consolidation of royal power required the construction of an institutional infrastructure that could extract the resources and maintain the order that were the lifeblood of the state, a construction that Harald, through a combination of political genius and ruthless, coercive power, successfully accomplished. The wave of emigration that followed Harald Fairhair's unification, the massive, population-level movement of thousands of Norsemen and their families across the cold, grey waters of the North Atlantic to the empty, volcanic shores of Iceland and the green, windswept islands of the Shetlands, the Orkneys, and the Faroes, was not a random, haphazard flight of defeated warriors but a deliberate, politically motivated exodus, a collective rejection of the new, centralized monarchy and a conscious effort to preserve, in the remote, king-free wilderness of the Atlantic, the ancient, thing-based liberties and the independent, clan-oriented social order that Harald's conquest had destroyed. The Sagas, particularly the Landnámabók, the great 12th century compilation that records the names, the genealogies, and the land claims of the first settlers of Iceland, are explicit about the political motivations of the emigrants. They were the Stormenni, the great men, the chieftains and the Hersir who had refused to bow to Harald's tax collectors, who had been stripped of their ancestral lands, and who had chosen, rather than live as the king's tenants, to gather their families, their livestock, their slaves, and their portable wealth, and to set sail for a new land where there was no king, where a man could be his own master, and where the old customs, the customs of the thing and the blot, could be practiced without the interference of a royal steward. The Landnámabók, which is a unique, invaluable source for the history of the settlement, lists over 400 of the original settlers, their places of origin in Norway, their family connections, and the locations of their land claims in Iceland, and a significant proportion of these settlers are explicitly described as men who had fled from the tyranny of King Harald, a phrase that has become the classic encapsulation of the political dynamic that drove the Landnam. The chronology of the settlement of Iceland, which began around 874, just a few years after the Battle of Hafrsfjord, and was substantially complete by the year 930, a period of less than 2 generations, is a chronology that is intimately bound up with the history of Harald's unification, a chronology that makes Iceland, in a very real sense, the child of the Norwegian unification. A society that was founded, in a deliberate, self-conscious act of political creation, by the very men who had been Harald's most determined opponents. The traditional story of the discovery and the settlement of Iceland, which is recounted in the Icelandic, the short, 12th century history of Iceland written by the priest Ari Orgelson, and in the Landnámabók, is a story of a series of accidental discoveries. The Norse sailors Naded and Gerisvaversen, who were blown off course in the 860s and who circumnavigated the island, naming it, respectively, Snaeland, Snowland, and Gerarsimi, Geras Island. The Norwegian Viking Floki Viljararson, who attempted to settle the island in the late 860s and who gave it its final name, Island, Iceland, after a disastrous winter that killed his livestock, followed by the deliberate, large-scale settlement that was led by the Norwegian chieftain Ingolf Arnarsson, who, according to the tradition, cast the carved pillars of his high seat, the Andvejusler, into the sea as he approached the coast, vowing to build his farm where the pillars washed ashore, a sacred, ritual act that consecrated the new land to the gods of his ancestors. The pillars washed ashore at a bay on the southwest coast of the island, a bay that engulfer named Reykjavik, the Bay of Smokes, after the steaming, geothermal springs that he saw rising from the ground, and the farm that he built there, around the year 874, was the nucleus of the future capital of Iceland. The social and political structure of the Icelandic Commonwealth that the settlers constructed over the course of the Landnam period was a deliberate, self-conscious rejection of the centralized, monarchical model that Harald had imposed on Norway, a rejection that was rooted in the settlers' own recent, painful experience of political tyranny and that was expressed in the institutional arrangements of the new society, through the creation of a king-free, decentralized commonwealth, the Gjveldi, a republic of free, landowning farmers, the Bender, who governed themselves through a network of local thing assemblies, each presided over by a chieftain, the Gwa, who was both a political leader and a pagan priest. The Gor, whose office was, in the early period, a personal, non-territorial institution that was based on the voluntary allegiance of a group of followers, the Ingmen, were the functional equivalent of the Norwegian Hersir, the local chieftains who had been the backbone of the old, pre-Haraldian order, and their survival, in the new, Atlantic environment, was a direct institutional continuity with the political culture that Harald had sought to destroy. The Alþingi, the National Assembly that was established in the year 930 at Ingvellir, the Great Rift Valley plain in the southwest of the island where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are slowly, invisibly pulling apart, was the supreme legislative and judicial institution of the Commonwealth, a parliament of free men that met for 2 weeks every June, that made the laws of the land, and that settled the disputes that could not be resolved at the local level, and its creation, just 60 years after the first settlement, was a remarkable feat of political organization, a testament to the legal and political genius of the Norse settlers and their determination to create a just, orderly society without a king. The culture of the Icelandic Commonwealth, which was, in the centuries that followed, the crucible in which the great literature of the Norse world, the Sagas, the Eddic poems, the Skaldic verse, was composed and preserved, was a culture that was, in its deepest essence, a culture of memory, a culture that was obsessed with the past, with the genealogies of the first settlers, and with the deeds of the ancestors. A culture that had been transplanted, in a kind of frozen, suspended animation, from the Norway of the 9th century and that had been preserved, in the remote, isolated environment of the North Atlantic, long after the Norway that had produced it had been transformed by the forces of Christianization and royal centralization. The Icelanders, who were, by the 13th century, the most literate society in Europe, a society in which the sagas and the laws were written down in the vernacular, in the Old Norse language, rather than in the Latin of the Church, were the self-appointed guardians of the Norse heritage, the keepers of the flame, and the great works of medieval Icelandic literature. From the Heimskringla of Snorri Sturluson to the Landnámabók and the Íslendingasögur are the monuments that they erected to the memory of their ancestors, the men and women who had fled from the tyranny of Harald Fairhair and who had built, on the edge of the habitable world, a society that was, in its freedom and its creativity, the finest flower of the Old Norse civilization. The settlement of the other North Atlantic islands, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Faroes, and the Hebrides, which occurred in the same period as the Icelandic Landnam and which was driven by the same political pressures, was an integral part of the great Norse diaspora that Harald Fairhair's unification had set in motion, a diaspora that extended the reach of the Scandinavian language, law, and culture across the entire sweep of the North Atlantic, from the coast of Norway to the shores of Greenland and eventually, to the distant, fog-wreathed coast of Vinland, the land that the Norse sagas call Vinland, the land of wild grapes and self-sown wheat, the North American continent that the descendants of the Norwegian exiles were the first Europeans to reach. The Shetland and Orkney Islands, which lie approximately 200 and 300 kilometers respectively to the north of the Scottish mainland, were, according to the Saga accounts, already inhabited by a scattered population of Celtic Christians, the paper, when the first Norse settlers arrived in the early 9th century, and the islands, with their fertile soil, their rich fisheries, and their strategic location on the sea routes between Norway, the British Isles, and the North Atlantic, were quickly transformed into an integral part of the Scandinavian world, a world whose earls, the Jarlar of Orkney, were powerful, semi-independent rulers who controlled a maritime empire that extended, at its height, from the Hebrides to the Shetlands, and that played a central role in the politics of the Irish Sea and the Scottish mainland. The Orkneyinga Saga, the 13th century history of the Orkney Earls, traces the lineage of the Earls back to the reign of Harald Fairhair, who, according to the Saga, granted the islands to a certain Ragnvald of Mor, a powerful Norwegian chieftain who had supported Harald during the Unification Wars, and the earldom that Ragnvald and his descendants established was, in its political structure, a miniature version of the old, pre-Haraldian Norwegian polity, a realm of independent, searoving aristocrats who acknowledged, in theory, the overlordship of the Norwegian king but who, in practice, were virtually autonomous. The Faroe Islands, which lie approximately halfway between Norway and Iceland, a cluster of 18 small, volcanic islands that are lashed by the North Atlantic storms, were, according to the Saga tradition, first settled by a Norwegian chieftain named Grimur Kamban, who arrived around 825, a generation before the main wave of exiles that followed the Battle of Hafrsfjord, but the bulk of the settlement, which was recorded in the Færøinga Saga, the Saga of the Faroe Islanders, occurred in the late 9th century, when the islands were colonized by the same population of disaffected Norwegian chieftains and their followers who were simultaneously colonizing Iceland. The Faroe Islands, which were, like Iceland, an empty, uninhabited landscape of green, sheep-grazed hills and towering, bird-filled cliffs at the time of the Norse settlement, became a self-governing commonwealth, the Føroyar, that was, in its political institutions, a small-scale replica of the Icelandic Tveldi, a society of free farmers who governed themselves through a local thing, the Lagting, which is today, 1,000 years later, one of the oldest continuous parliamentary institutions in the world. The Faroe Islands, which were, throughout the Middle Ages, a remote, impoverished outpost of the Scandinavian world, dependent on the export of wool and the seasonal harvest of seabirds and pilot whales, preserved, in their isolation, the language, the customs, and the genetic heritage of the Norwegian settlers to a degree that is unmatched anywhere else in the North Atlantic, and the modern Faroese language, which is a direct descendant of the Old Norse that the settlers spoke, is, with the exception of Icelandic, the closest living relative of the medieval language of the Sagas. The colonization of the Scottish Islands and the coastal regions of the Scottish mainland, the zone that the Norse called the Suðuríjar, the Southern Isles, and that the Irish annals call the Gulgaidheil, the Foreign Gaels, was a process that began in the early 9th century, before Harald's unification, but that was accelerated by the influx of Norwegian exiles in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, an influx that transformed the political and cultural landscape of the region and that created a hybrid Norse-Gaelic culture that would dominate the Irish Sea zone for the next 3 centuries. The Hebrides, the great archipelago of islands that lies off the western coast of Scotland, were the heart of the Gulgaidheil world, a region in which the Norse settlers intermarried with the native Gaelic population, adopted elements of Gaelic language and dress, and created a distinctive, mixed culture that was, in its art, its poetry, and its political institutions, a fusion of the Scandinavian and the Celtic, a fusion that is embodied, in its most spectacular form, in the great stone crosses of the island of Iona, the holy island of St. Columba, which were carved by Norse Gaelic sculptors and which depict, in their intricate, interlacing panels, the ships and the warriors of the Viking sea kings alongside the saints and the angels of the Christian heaven. The Gulgaidheil zone, which included not only the Hebrides but the Isle of Man, the coast of Galloway in southwestern Scotland, and for a period in the 9th and 10th centuries, the city of Dublin in Ireland, was a zone of political turbulence and cultural creativity, a zone in which the descendants of the Norwegian exiles and the native Gaelic dynasties engaged in a perpetual, kaleidoscopic dance of war, marriage, and alliance, a dance that would, in the 11th and 12th centuries, produce the great lords of the Isles, the semi-independent sea kings who controlled the Hebrides and the western coast of Scotland and who were, in their power and their independence, the last, direct heirs of the old, pre-Haraldian Norse chieftaincy. The ultimate impact of the Norse diaspora on the history of the North Atlantic was a transformation of the human geography of the region, a transformation that extended the boundaries of the Scandinavian world across the ocean, that created a chain of Norse settlements that stretched from Norway to North America, and that established, for the first time, a permanent cultural and linguistic link between the European continent and the islands of the far North Atlantic, a link that would, in the centuries that followed, be the channel through which the Christian religion, the European literary tradition, and the institutions of the medieval state were transmitted to the farthest corners of the Scandinavian world. The Harald Fairhair who emerges from this diaspora history is not the conqueror of the sagas but the unwitting father of a new, Atlantic civilization, a man whose centralizing policies had the paradoxical, unintended effect of scattering his people across the ocean, planting the seeds of the Norse language and the Norse law in the virgin soil of Iceland and the Faroes and the green, windswept islands of the Shetlands and the Orkneys, a scattering that would, in the long run, preserve the culture of the Old Norse world long after the Norway that had expelled it had been transformed into a Christian, centralized kingdom. The legal and constitutional revolution that Harald Fairhair imposed on Norway, and that his successors in the 10th and 11th centuries refined and extended, was a revolution that fundamentally altered the relationship between the individual and the state, a shift from the old, clan-based, thing-centered system of justice, in which the prosecution and punishment of wrongs was a private, familial responsibility, to a new, public system, in which the king, acting through his appointed officials, claimed a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, and asserted the right to punish crimes, to collect fines, and to settle disputes in his own name and in his own courts, a shift that was, in its essence, the birth of the Norwegian state as a sovereign, law-giving entity. The traditional system of Norse law, which was preserved in the oral, customary codes that the Lgskummer recited at the Thing, was a system of compensation, the wergild, the payment of a fixed, carefully graduated sum of money to the family of the victim of a killing, a system that was designed to replace the older, more destructive practice of the blood feud, the endless, escalating cycle of vengeance that could devastate entire families and that threatened the fragile peace of the community. The wergild system, which classified every free man, woman, and child according to their social status and which assigned a specific monetary value to their life, was a rational, pragmatic response to the endemic violence of a warrior society, but it was also a system that, by treating violence as a private, financial matter between the king groups, implicitly denied the king any role in the maintenance of the public peace. A denial that Harald, with his centralizing, state-building ambitions, could not tolerate. The legislation that Harald promulgated, which the Sagas attribute to his own royal authority, acting on the advice of his council of jarls and wise men, was designed to supplement, and in some cases, to override the traditional, customary law, introducing new categories of crime, such as treason, rebellion, and the refusal to pay the royal taxes, that were punished not by the payment of wergild to the victim's family but by the confiscation of the offender's property, the payment of a fine to the king, and in the most extreme cases, the sentence of death, a sentence that was carried out not by the victim's kin but by the king's own officials. The creation of a category of public crimes, crimes against the king and against the peace of the realm, was a fundamental innovation in Norse legal thought, an innovation that signaled the emergence of a new, state-centered conception of justice, a conception in which the king, as the supreme guardian of the public order, had a direct, personal interest in the punishment of wrongdoers. An interest that superseded the private interests of the victim and his family. The royal officials who were charged with the enforcement of this new, royal law, the Armen, were the king's eyes and ears in the countryside, the agents of the centralizing state, and their presence, in every district of the kingdom, was a constant, visible reminder to the local population that the old, self-governing, thing-based order had been superseded by a new, hierarchical order, an order in which the king's writ and the king's justice ran from the Hafrsfjord to the farthest, icebound reaches of the Finnmark. The creation of the royal monopoly on violence, the claim that the king, and the king alone, had the right to wage war, to levy armies, and to extract the revenues that were necessary to support the military establishment, was the military dimension of the legal revolution, a dimension that was expressed, in institutional terms, through the establishment of the Lyanger. The naval levy that required every coastal district, every Skypria, to provide a fully equipped longship, its crew, and its provisions for a fixed period of service each year, a levy that was the direct, coercive instrument of the king's control of the sea routes, and that was the ultimate guarantor of the royal peace. The Leanger, which was, in its fully developed form, a system of universal military obligation, a system that required every free man, the bondi, to serve in the fleet or to pay a tax in lieu of service, was a transformation of the old, voluntary, chieftain-led warband into a new, compulsory, royal institution, an institution that was, in its capacity to mobilize the entire military resources of the kingdom, a far more formidable instrument of power than any private fleet that a rebellious Jarl could assemble. The king, who was the supreme commander of the Leanger, could summon the fleet to assemble at a designated port, could lead it on campaigns of conquest or defense, and could use it, if necessary, to crush any internal rebellion that threatened the stability of the realm, a capacity that gave the Haraldian monarchy a military muscle that the old, decentralized system of the petty kingdoms had never possessed. The relationship between Harald's legal innovations and the subsequent development of the Norwegian state, which was, by the 13th century, a unified Christian kingdom with a written law code, the Magnus Lagabot's Landslov, the Land's Law of King Magnus the Lawmender, promulgated in 1274, was a relationship of direct, institutional continuity, a continuity that can be traced through the 10th and 11th centuries, in the charters of the Norwegian kings, the records of the things, and the evolving jurisprudence of the royal courts. The Gulathing law, which was committed to writing in the 11th century and which preserves, in its archaic, alliterative language, the memory of the Haraldian legal reforms, is the oldest surviving Norwegian law code, and its provisions, which cover the entire range of legal and social life, from the inheritance of the land to the punishment of the secret murderer, the Morvager, are the foundation of the Norwegian legal tradition, a tradition that, in its essential principles, was the creation of the Unification period and that would, in the centuries that followed, be refined, Christianized, and written down, but never fundamentally altered. The Harald Fairhair who emerges from this legal history is not the berserker of the Hafrsfjord but the lawgiver, the lagasmer, the king who understood that the sword could conquer a kingdom but that only the law could hold it together, and whose true monument is not the mound at Evaldens but the legal and institutional order that he bequeathed to his successors. The later years of Harald Fairhair's long reign, which extended, according to the conventional chronology, from his accession around 860 to his death around 930, a span of approximately 70 years, were a period of increasingly bitter and violent internal conflict, a period in which the king, now an old, white-haired man, his magnificent mane long since shorn, his body worn by the decades of campaigning, was forced to confront the most intractable problem of any patrimonial monarchy, the rivalry of his own sons, the Harald Signer, who, as they grew to manhood and tasted the heady wine of power, began to quarrel among themselves over the succession to the throne, a quarrel that would, in the years after their father's death, plunge the kingdom into a civil war that would last for over a century. The sagas recount that Harald, who had fathered by his numerous wives and concubines a vast brood of sons, Snorri names at least 20, including the famous Eirik Blood Axe, the brutal and ambitious Olaf Geirstadaf, the gentle and popular Hakon the Good, and a host of lesser, shadowy figures whose deeds are lost to history, attempted, in his old age, to settle the succession by designating his favorite son, Eirik Bloodaxe, as the Fyrkanungr, the High King, the supreme ruler of the entire realm, with the other sons to be subordinated to him as regional subkings, a settlement that was, in its attempt to reconcile the centralizing imperative of the monarchy with the traditional, patrimonial expectation that every son should inherit a share of the father's property, a recipe for disaster. The succession crisis that Harald's death ignited, which the sagas describe in a tone of tragic, elegiac melancholy, was a crisis that was rooted in the fundamental contradiction of the Haraldian monarchy, a contradiction between the new, centralizing ideology of a single, indivisible kingdom and the old, deeply entrenched custom of the partible inheritance. The custom that required the father's property to be divided, equally or in some proportion, among all his sons, a custom that was the foundation of the Norse family structure, and that could not be easily or quickly abolished. Eirik Bloodaxe, who was, according to the Sagas, a man of exceptional cruelty and ambition, a man who had killed his own brothers in his quest for power, was the designated heir, but his brutal, tyrannical rule, which the Sagas portray as a reign of terror that alienated the Norwegian aristocracy and drove the population into the arms of his rivals, was a direct, and perhaps inevitable, consequence of the centralizing project that his father had initiated, a project that had concentrated so much power in the hands of the king that the character of the individual who wielded that power became the decisive factor in the fate of the kingdom. The nobles who had chafed under Harald's taxation and his royal officials found, in the rebellion against Eirik, an opportunity to avenge their lost liberties, and the exiled Hakon, who had been fostered at the court of the Christian Anglo-Saxon King Athelstan, returned to Norway in the early 930s, overthrew Eirik, and was proclaimed king by the Thing assemblies, a revolution that was, in its rejection of the tyrannical son of Harald, a partial repudiation of the Haraldian model of royal absolutism. The reign of Hakon the Good, which lasted from approximately 934 to 961, was a period of partial, cautious reform, a period in which the new king, who was a Christian convert but who wisely refrained from forcing his religion upon his pagan subjects, attempted to repair the damage that his father's and his brother's reigns had inflicted on the relationship between the crown and the aristocracy, and to find a balance between the centralizing imperative of the monarchy and the traditional liberties of the freeholders, a balance that would be the central, and ultimately insoluble, problem of Norwegian politics for the next 3 centuries. Hakon, who is remembered in the sagas as a wise and beloved king, a king who was called the Good by his grateful people, established a new system of military organization, the Leanger that we have already discussed, and he attempted, unsuccessfully, to introduce Christianity to the Norwegian Things, a project that was defeated by the fierce, organized resistance of the pagan farmers of Trøndelag, the region that was the heartland of the old religion and the most stubborn bastion of the pre-Haraldian political culture. The reign of Hakon, which ended with his death in battle at the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 961, fighting against the sons of Eirik Bloodaxe, who had returned from their exile in Denmark with a fleet of longships to reclaim their father's throne, was a prelude to the further civil wars that would rack Norway throughout the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the wars that would culminate in the triumph of the Christian centralizing monarchy under Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, who completed the work that Harald Fairhair had begun. The succession of rulers who followed Hakon, the alternating, violent sequence of the sons and grandsons of Harald Fairhair who seized, held, and lost the Norwegian throne over the course of the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the brutal, pagan Harald Greycloak, the Danish-backed Earl Hakon Sigurdsson, the messianic, Christian Olaf Tryggvason, the unifying, law-giving Olaf Haraldsson, were, in a sense, the working out of the contradictions that were inherent in the Haraldian settlement, the long, bloody aftermath of the Unification, as the Norwegian state, which had been created by the sword of a single, remarkable man, struggled to find the stable, institutional form that would enable it to survive the death of its founder. The Norway that emerged from this century of civil war, the Norway of the 11th century, was a Christian, centralized kingdom, a kingdom whose king was the lord of the land, whose law was the king's law, and whose church was the king's church, a kingdom that was, in its essential institutional features, the realization of the project that Harald Fairhair had initiated, a project that had been, for a century, suspended in the chaos of the succession, but that was, by the time of the death of St. Olaf at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, finally and irrevocably achieved. The personal tragedy of Harald Fairhair, the tragedy of the old king who lived too long, whose sons had grown up in the shadow of a father who was so great that they could never hope to equal him, and whose final years were consumed by the bitter, fratricidal conflicts that his own success had created, is a tragedy that the sagas, with their profound, Shakespearean insight into the human heart, portray with a moving, elegiac tenderness. Snorri, in the Heimskringla, depicts the aged Harald, his body weakened by age, his mind clouded by grief, handing over the rule of the kingdom to Eirik, his favorite, and then retiring, in a kind of dignified, melancholy seclusion, to the royal estate at Avaldens, where he died, 3 years later, and was buried in a great mound, a hauger, that overlooked the waters of the Karmsund. The sea road that had been the spine of his kingdom, a fitting, poignant end for the king who had united the land, and whose death was the signal for the chaos that would tear his kingdom apart. The historical Harald Fairhair, the flesh and blood king who lived and fought and died in the 9th and early 10th centuries, is a figure who is, like his predecessors in the Yngling line and his contemporaries in the other early medieval kingdoms, a figure who exists in a shadowy, liminal zone between the bright, hard light of documentary history and the diffuse, flickering glow of oral tradition, a zone in which the careful, critical historian must tread with the utmost caution, sifting the few precious fragments of contemporary evidence from the vast, later accumulation of legend, propaganda, and literary embellishment. The contemporary sources for Harald's reign are, by the standards of the 9th century, not negligible, but they are, by the standards of modern historical scholarship, frustratingly sparse, consisting of a small corpus of skaldic verses that were composed for Harald and his sons by the court poets of the Yngling dynasty, a few, brief, and ambiguous references in the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon annals, and the archaeological record of the royal centers, the burial mounds, and the hoards of silver. That are the material residue of the Unification period. The skaldic poetry, which is the most important of these contemporary sources, is a problematic, difficult body of evidence, a poetry that is composed in an intricate, metaphor-laden diction that is designed to be memorable and to be recited, but that is also designed to flatter the patron and to glorify the deeds of the king, and the historian who attempts to extract reliable, factual information from the praise poems of the skalds must navigate a treacherous sea of hyperbole, mythological allusion, and poetic convention. The Haraldskvi of Orbjörn Hornklofi, which is the longest and the most detailed of the contemporary skaldic poems about Harald, is a magnificent, alliterative ode that celebrates the king's victory at Hafrsfjord, his generosity to his warriors, and his disdain for the soft, effeminate luxuries of the Christian South, a poem that is, in its vivid, concrete imagery and its fierce, pagan pride, one of the masterpieces of the Viking Age literary canon, a poem that has been, for over a millennium, the foundational text of the Norwegian national myth. The poem, which is preserved in a fragmentary state in the 13th century Heimskringla, describes Harald's warriors, the berserkers and the wolf-skinned, the Lfener, the shock troops who wore the skins of wolves and who fought in a state of sacred, shamanistic frenzy, a description that is, for the modern reader, a window into the dark, irrational, and terrifying heart of the Viking warrior culture. A culture that valued, above all things, the ecstatic, self-annihilating courage that was the gift of Odin, the god of the hanged and the slain. The poem also provides a list of Harald's enemies at Hafrsfjord, a list that includes the names of the chieftains who had fled before his advance: Job the Rich, the kings of Rogaland and Hordaland, the jarls of the western coast, and this list, which is corroborated, in its general outline, by the later Saga tradition, is the most reliable historical core of the entire Hafrsfjord narrative. A kernel of fact around which the later, legendary accretions have crystallized. The archaeological record of the Unification period, which is the other major source of contemporary evidence for Harald's reign, is a record that is, by its nature, mute and ambiguous, a record of the material culture of the late 9th century, the burial mounds, the royal halls, the hoards of silver, that must be interpreted, with the aid of the texts, to yield its historical secrets. An interpretation that is, by the nature of the evidence, always tentative and always subject to revision. The great burial mound at Avaldens, on the island of Karmøy, which is traditionally identified as the grave of Harald Fairhair, is a massive, earthen monument, a hauger that is, in its sheer size and its commanding position overlooking the Karmsund, a fitting tomb for the unifier of Norway, a monument that proclaims, in the silent language of the landscape, the power and the prestige of the man who was buried there. The excavation of the Avaldens mound, which has been investigated, though not fully excavated by modern archaeologists, has revealed a complex, multi-phase burial that dates from the Viking Age, but the grave has been disturbed, the bones of the occupant have been scattered, and the identification of the mound as the tomb of Harald, while plausible and supported by a long, continuous local tradition, remains, in the absence of a definitive inscription or a genetic identification, a matter of faith rather than of proof. The royal estate at Valsnes, which was, according to Snorri, Harald's favorite residence, has been the subject of intensive archaeological investigation in recent decades, and the excavations have revealed a rich, high-status settlement that was occupied, continuously, from the early Viking Age through the High Middle Ages, a settlement that was, in its layout and its material culture, the center of a regional political power that was of a scale that is consistent with the Saga's portrait of the Haraldian monarchy. The later Saga tradition, which is the most detailed and the most accessible source for Harald's life, is a tradition that was composed, in its surviving form, in the 13th century, over 300 years after the events it describes, and that is, therefore, a record not of the 9th century reality but of the 13th century memory of that reality, a memory that has been shaped over the intervening centuries by the processes of oral transmission, by the political needs of the Norwegian monarchy, and by the literary genius of Snorri Sturluson, the master of the saga form, who selected, arranged, and embellished his material to create a narrative that was, in its structure and its themes, a work of art as much as a work of history. The Heimskringla, which is the greatest of the king's sagas, is a magnificent, sweeping narrative that traces the history of the Norwegian dynasty from its mythic, Odin-descended origins in the midst of the ancient past to the reign of King Magnus Erlingsson in the late 12th century, and the Harald Fairhair who emerges from Snorri's pages is a character of immense, three-dimensional complexity. A king who is at once a heroic conqueror, a wise lawgiver, and a tragic, Lear-like figure, destroyed by the very sons he had raised to power, a character who is, in his humanity and his complexity, a creation of the 13th century, not a documentary record of the 9th. The modern scholarly consensus on Harald Fairhair, which has been shaped by the critical, source-skeptical methods that were pioneered by the Swedish historian Kurt Weibel in the early 20th century and that have been refined by subsequent generations of Scandinavian and Anglophone historians, is a consensus that accepts the broad outline of Harald's career, his origin in Vestfold, his unification of the Norwegian petty kingdoms, his victory at Hafrsfjord, his imposition of a new, centralized administrative and fiscal system, and the wave of emigration that his policies provoked, as historical facts, but that treats the details of the saga narrative, particularly the Gyda episode and the vow of the uncut hair, as legendary embellishments that were added, in the centuries after Harald's death, to explain and to justify the unification in terms that were comprehensible to the Saga Age Icelanders. The historical Harald Fairhair, the herald of the contemporary skaldic verse and the archaeology, was probably a formidable, successful, and utterly ruthless Viking chieftain, a man whose political genius lay not in any romantic, love-struck vow but in his ability to build a fleet, to defeat his enemies one by one, and to construct an administrative apparatus that transformed the personal, charismatic authority of the traditional Norse chieftain into the impersonal, institutional authority of a king, a transformation that was the foundation of the medieval Norwegian state. The legacy of Harald Fairhair in the culture, the politics, and the national identity of Norway, from the Middle Ages to the present day, is a legacy that is so pervasive, so deeply embedded in the fabric of the Norwegian self-image, that it is difficult, for the modern observer, to separate the historical reality from the national myth, the man from the legend. The 9th century warlord from the symbol of Norwegian unity and independence that he has, for a millennium, represented. The Norwegian monarchy, which is today a constitutional, ceremonial institution, a beloved symbol of the nation's continuity and its democratic values, traces its lineage, in an unbroken line, back to Harald Fairhair, a genealogy that is, in its earliest links, a matter of faith and tradition rather than of documentary proof, but that has, nonetheless, a profound, symbolic importance. A claim that the modern, prosperous, egalitarian Norway, the Norway of the oil wealth and the Nobel Peace Prize, is the direct, institutional descendant of the harsh, pagan, warrior kingdom that was forged in the slaughter of Hafrsfjord. The Norwegian National Day, the 17th of May, which commemorates the signing of the Eidsvoll Constitution in 1814, the document that declared Norway's independence from Denmark and that established the Norwegian state as a constitutional monarchy, is a celebration that, in its public rhetoric and its popular culture, is infused with the memory of Harald Fairhair, the founder of the Norwegian kingdom. The symbol of the nation's ancient, proud, and independent origins. The cultural nationalism of the 19th century, which was the intellectual and artistic movement that accompanied Norway's struggle for independence from Sweden and that sought to construct a distinctive, uniquely Norwegian national identity, seized upon the figure of Harald Fairhair as the ideal, heroic ancestor, the embodiment of the Norwegian spirit. The king who had united the land and who had made the Norwegian people, for the first time, a single, sovereign nation. The poets, the painters, and the composers of the Norwegian Romantic movement, the poet Henrik Wergeland, the painter Peter Nikolai Arbo, the composer Edvard Grieg, celebrated the deeds of Harald Fairhair and his warriors in their works, transforming the medieval saga material into a modern, national epic. An epic that was intended to inspire the Norwegian people in their contemporary struggle for political and cultural self-determination. The great painting by Peter Nikolai Arbo, The Battle of Hafrsfjord, which was completed in 1870 and which hangs, in all its monumental, romantic glory, in the National Gallery of Norway, is a powerful, visual representation of the national myth, a painting that depicts the climactic moment of the battle, the longships clashing in the narrow waters of the fjord, the warriors, their swords raised, their faces set in expressions of fierce, pagan pride, fighting and dying for the glory of the king and the future of the nation, a painting that, for generations of Norwegians, has defined the image of the Viking Age. The archaeological and historical research of the 20th and 21st centuries, which has transformed our understanding of the Viking Age and the Unification period, has, paradoxically, both challenged and reinforced the traditional, saga-based image of Harald Fairhair, challenging the literal truth of the legendary episodes, such as the Gyda story and the Hair Vow, but reinforcing the fundamental historical reality of the unification, the conquest of the petty kingdoms, the Battle of Hafrsfjord, and the creation of a centralized, Norwegian state. The excavations at Ådal, which have revealed the existence of a major, high-status royal center that was occupied throughout the Viking Age and that commanded the strategic seer out of the Karmsund, have provided a material, archaeological anchor for the saga tradition, a physical location that can be identified, with a reasonable degree of confidence, as the seat of the Haraldian monarchy. A place where the king held his court, dispensed his justice, and in the end, was buried. The discovery of a massive, Viking Age ship burial at Gjellestad, in the Hafrsfjord region, in 2018, a burial that is, in its size and its wealth, comparable to the great ship burials of Oseberg and Gokstad, has provided further, dramatic evidence of the concentration of political power and material resources in the hands of the Yngling dynasty in the very period of Harald's conquests. A concentration that is the material correlate of the centralization that the sagas describe. The Harald Fairhair who emerges from the modern, interdisciplinary scholarship is a figure who is both more and less than the legendary hero of the sagas, less, because the romantic, love-struck youth of the Gyda story is a literary creation, a figure of folktale and epic poetry, not a historical reality, and more, because the historical Harald, the hard-headed, calculating, and utterly ruthless political genius who constructed the Norwegian state, was a figure of far greater historical significance than any romantic, lovesick prince could ever be, a figure whose achievements, the unification of Norway, the creation of a centralized monarchy, and the unleashing of the Norse diaspora across the North Atlantic, were among the most consequential events of the early medieval period, events that altered the political, cultural, and demographic map of Europe and that set the stage for the later global expansion of the Scandinavian peoples. The Harald Fairhair who is celebrated on the 17th of May, who is taught in the Norwegian schools, and who is the subject of this documentary, is the historical Harald, the founder of the Norwegian state, a figure who, whatever the embellishments of the saga tradition, deserves to be remembered as one of the great, transformative figures of the Viking Age. The monument to Harald Fairhair that stands at Hafrsfjord, a massive, bronze sculpture of the king, his hair flowing in the wind, his sword raised in a gesture of command, is a monument that is, in its combination of historical reference and modern, nationalist symbolism, the perfect expression of the Norwegian relationship to its founding hero, a relationship that is at once critical and celebratory, historical and mythical, a relationship that recognizes the gap between the 9th century reality and the 21st century memory, but that also celebrates the continuity, the unbroken thread of the Norwegian nation, that links the modern, democratic kingdom to the harsh, pagan, warrior world of its first king. The broader impact of Harald Fairhair's unification on the trajectory of the Viking Age, and on the subsequent history of the North Atlantic world, was an impact that was, in its scope and its duration, far greater than the king himself could ever have anticipated, an impact that extended, in a chain of unintended, long-term consequences. From the colonization of Iceland and the Faroes to the discovery and attempted settlement of Greenland and Vinland, the North American continent that the Norse explorers, the descendants of the Norwegian exiles, were the first Europeans to reach. The unification of Norway, which centralized the political authority of the kingdom in the hands of a single, overmighty king, had the paradoxical, dialectical effect of simultaneously strengthening the Norwegian state and scattering the Norwegian people, because the same centralization that created the powerful, tax-extracting monarchy that was the foundation of the medieval kingdom also drove the most independent, the most recalcitrant, and the most enterprising of the Norwegian chieftains into exile, an exile that carried the Norse language, the Norse law, and the Norse ship technology to the farthest, empty corners of the North Atlantic, planting the seeds of new societies that would, in time, become the modern nations of Iceland and the Faroe Islands. The Harald who, in the short term, was the unifier of Norway was, in the long term, the unwitting father of the Icelandic Commonwealth and the Norse Atlantic diaspora, a diaspora that was the greatest, most enduring demographic and cultural legacy of the Viking Age. The colonization of Iceland, which we have discussed in an earlier chapter, was the centerpiece of this diaspora, and the society that the settlers constructed, the king-free, thing-based Commonwealth, was a society that, in its institutions and its ethos, was a deliberate, self-conscious rejection of the centralized, monarchical model that Harald had imposed on the homeland. A rejection that was the founding political act of the Icelandic nation and that was, for over 3 centuries, the defining characteristic of Icelandic culture. The Icelandic Commonwealth, which was, in its political structure, a republic of free, landowning farmers, a society without a king, without a standing army, and without a centralized bureaucracy, was a unique, remarkable experiment in self-government. An experiment that was made possible by the extreme isolation of the island and by the absence of the external military pressures that had forced the continental European societies to develop the centralized, monarchical states that were the norm of the Middle Ages. The Alþingi, the annual National Assembly at Ingvellir, was the symbolic and institutional heart of the Commonwealth, a gathering of the free men of Iceland that was, in its combination of a legislative, judicial, and social function, a kind of early, proto-parliament, a forum in which the laws were recited, the disputes were settled, and the news and the gossip of the island were exchanged, and its creation. In the year 930, just 60 years after the first permanent settlement, was a testament to the political sophistication and the legal genius of the Norse settlers, a genius that had been transplanted, in the gnar of the exiles, from the things of western Norway to the lava fields of the Ingvellir plain. The discovery and the attempted settlement of Greenland, which was undertaken, around 985, by Eirik the Red, a Norwegian chieftain who had been exiled from Iceland for murder, was the next, logical step in the westward expansion of the Norse diaspora, an expansion that was driven by the same combination of political exile, demographic pressure, and the eternal, restless Viking hunger for new land that had driven the colonization of the Atlantic islands. Eirik, who named the vast, ice-covered land Greenland, in a deliberate act of propagandistic marketing, a name that was designed to attract settlers to a land that was, in reality, far from green, established two settlements, the eastern and the western settlements, on the southwestern coast of the island, settlements that, at their peak in the 12th and 13th centuries, supported a population of perhaps 2,000 to 5,000 souls, a population that lived, in a fragile, precarious balance, on the edge of the habitable world, dependent on the pastoral farming of sheep and cattle, the hunting of seal and walrus, and the trade in the precious walrus ivory that was the most valuable export of the Greenland settlements. The Greenland settlements, which endured for over 4 centuries, were, in their isolation, their harshness, and their ultimate, mysterious disappearance in the 15th century, the most extreme expression of the Norse diaspora that Harald Fairhair had, unwittingly, set in motion, a community that clung, with a desperate, tenacious courage, to the farthest edge of the known world, and that vanished, at last, into the silence of the Arctic, leaving behind only the stone ruins of their churches and their farmsteads as a mute, enigmatic memorial to their existence. The discovery of Vinland, the North American continent, which the Norse sagas attribute to the Greenland explorer Leif Erikson, the son of Eirik the Red, around the year 1000, was the final, furthest reach of the Norse expansion, the moment when the descendants of the Norwegian exiles, who had been driven from their homeland by the centralizing ambition of Harald Fairhair, became the first Europeans to set foot on the shores of the New World, an achievement that was, in its audacity and its historical significance, a fitting climax to the great diaspora that the Unification had unleashed. The sagas that recount the Vinland voyages, the Groenlandinga Saga and the Eirik Saga Raua, are a mixture of historical memory and literary embellishment, a blend of fact and fiction that has tantalized and frustrated historians for centuries. But the archaeological discovery of the Norse settlement at Longship Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, in 1960, by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife and Stein Ingstad, provided the definitive, material proof that the Norse had, indeed, reached North America, a discovery that was one of the most sensational and significant events in the history of New World archaeology. The settlement at Longship Meadows, which was a small, temporary base camp that was occupied for a few years around the year 1000, was not a permanent colony but a way station, a gateway to the vast, forested, and richly resourced lands that lay beyond, the lands that the sagas call Vinland, the land of wild grapes, and that the Norse, for reasons that are still debated, were unable or unwilling to colonize permanently, a failure that left the New World to the indigenous peoples and to the later, more powerful European empires that would, in the 15th and 16th centuries, begin the conquest that the Norse had abandoned. The ultimate legacy of the Norse diaspora, which was the product of the political pressures that Harald Fairhair's unification had generated, was the creation of a transatlantic, Scandinavian culture zone, a zone that was bound together by the sea roads that the longships plied, a zone in which the Norse language, the Norse law, and the Norse myths were the common heritage of the scattered island communities of the North Atlantic, a zone that, in the centuries that followed, would be Christianized, integrated into the European state system, and in the case of Iceland and the Faroes, transformed into modern, independent nations that still, in their language, their law, and their culture, bear the indelible imprint of their Norse origins. The Harald Fairhair who emerges from this diaspora history is not the conqueror of Hafrsfjord but the unwitting founder of a new, Atlantic world, a man whose centralizing policies had the paradoxical, unintended consequence of scattering his people across the ocean, a scattering that preserved, in the remote, isolated island republics of the far North Atlantic, the language, the law, and the spirit of the old, pre-Haraldian Norse civilization, long after the Norway that had produced it had been transformed into a Christian, feudal kingdom. The complex, contradictory, and deeply human figure of Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, who has been, for a millennium, a symbol of national unity and a subject of intense scholarly debate, is a figure who, in his combination of visionary ambition and ruthless pragmatism, of romantic legend and hard-headed statecraft, of heroic achievement and tragic, personal failure, embodies the fundamental paradox of the Viking Age, an age that was, in its essence, an age of transition, a bridge between the old, pagan, clan-based world of the Germanic Iron Age and the new, Christian, state-based world of the High Middle Ages, a bridge that the Norsemen, in their longships and their migrations, built with their swords and their words, their blood and their poetry. The unification of Norway, which was the great, life-consuming project of Harald's reign, was a project that was, in its immediate, military dimension, a project of conquest, a project of the sword, a project that was achieved through the brutal, systematic application of violence, the annihilation of the old aristocracy, and the imposition of a new, centralized, tax-extracting administrative apparatus that was, in its essence, a machine for the extraction of resources and the suppression of resistance. Yet the Norway that emerged from this crucible of violence was not merely a conquered territory, a sullen, oppressed province of a despotic monarchy. It was a genuine, organic political community, a nation in the making, a people who were bound together, over the course of the centuries that followed Harald's death, by a common language, a common law, a common religion, and a common memory of the great king who had first given them a collective identity. The Iceland that Harald's policies created, the king-free commonwealth that was the refuge of the exiles, was, in its own way, as great an achievement as the unified Norway, a society that was, in its political creativity, its literary brilliance, and its fierce, independent spirit, the finest flower of the Old Norse civilization, a society that preserved, in the remote, volcanic fastness of the North Atlantic, the memory and the customs of the pre-Haraldian world, and that, in the Sagas and the Eddas, bequeathed to the modern world the incomparable treasure of the Old Norse literature, the literature that is our primary window into the mind and the soul of the Viking Age. The paradox of Harald Fairhair, the paradox that makes him such a compelling and such a challenging figure, is that he was, simultaneously, the destroyer and the preserver, the king who crushed the old order and the king whose actions inadvertently created the conditions for the preservation of that order. The tyrant whose oppression was the catalyst for the emigration that scattered the seeds of Norse culture across the Atlantic, the conqueror who, by building a state, made possible the survival of the nation. The Harald who emerges from this documentary is not a figure who can be simply admired or simply condemned. He is a figure who must be understood, in his full, complex, and contradictory humanity, a man who was, like all great historical figures, a mixture of light and darkness, of creation and destruction, a man whose legacy, 1,000 years after his death, is still alive. In the institutions of the Norwegian state, in the language of the Icelandic sagas, and in the DNA of the millions of people across the globe who carry the genes of the Norse settlers. The final, symbolic image of Harald Fairhair, the image that has been immortalized in the poetry, the painting, and the popular culture of the Norwegian nation, is the image of the king, standing on the deck of his dragon ship, his long, golden hair flying in the wind, his sword raised in a gesture of command and defiance, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, the horizon of the unconquered future. A symbol of the restless, indomitable, and creative spirit of the Viking Age, a spirit that built longships and crossed oceans, that carved runes and sang the praises of the gods, that destroyed kingdoms and built new worlds, a spirit that, in the figure of Harald Fairhair, found its most complete and most enduring human embodiment. The story of Harald Fairhair, the shock-haired youth who became the fair-haired king, is a story that belongs not only to Norway but to the entire world, a story that is, in its essential themes of ambition, violence, and transformation, a universal human story, a story that speaks to the deepest, most abiding questions of the human condition, the nature of power, the cost of order, and the mystery of how a great leader, through the sheer force of his will and the brilliance of his mind, can alter the course of history. The immediate aftermath of Harald Fairhair's death around 930, which the saga sources date with a deliberate, symbolic precision to the third year after he had handed the full reins of power to his chosen heir Eirik Bloodaxe, was a period of sudden, violent decompression, as the immense, concentrated pressure of the old king's will, which had held the fractious Norwegian polity together for 7 decades through sheer force of personality and institutional terror, was abruptly released, and the centrifugal forces that had been suppressed since Hafrsfjord erupted with a ferocity that would consume the kingdom in civil war for the next century. The sagas, particularly the Heimskringla and the Agrip af Norgeskonungasagam, depict the accession of Eirik Bloodaxe with a dark, foreboding palette, painting the new king as a man whose name was a prophecy of his nature, Bilex, the Bloodaxe, a nickname that, whether it was earned on the battlefields of the Baltic, where he had raided as a young man, or in the domestic slaughter of his own brothers, perfectly captured the brutal, fratricidal logic of the succession crisis that now unfolded. Eirik, who was the son of Harald and Ragnhild the Mighty, the daughter of the Danish King Eirik of Jutland, had been groomed for the throne from his youth, raised in the household of the powerful Jarl Rir the Silent of Hordaland, and given command of the royal fleet, while his brothers were still children. A position that had given him a taste for absolute authority and a contempt for the rights and the ambitions of his half-siblings that would, when he finally ascended to the Firkonungur title, prove fatal to the fragile unity that his father had constructed. The saga narrative of Eirik's brief, brutal reign, which lasted, according to the most reliable chronologies, from approximately 930 to 934, is a chronicle of escalating violence, a sequence of assassinations and pitched battles that pitted the new High King against his own brothers, each of whom had been granted a subordinate kingdom by Harald and each of whom now saw Eirik's elevation as an intolerable insult and a direct threat to their own survival. The first brother to die was Olaf Haraldsson, the king of Vestfold and the richest of the sub-kings, who, according to Snorri, was murdered by Eirik's men at a feast, a treacherous violation of the sacred laws of hospitality that shocked the Norwegian aristocracy and that signaled, with a brutal clarity, that the new king would not be bound by the customary restraints that had limited the power of even the most overmighty chieftains. The second to die was Bjorn Farman, the king of Tunsberg, a son of Harald by the beautiful Svanhild, who was ambushed and killed by Eirik's men while he was traveling through the Hafrsfjord on a trading expedition, his body dumped in the sea, his kingdom absorbed into the royal domain, and his surviving followers scattered into the exile that was the familiar, bitter fruit of the Haraldian monarchy. The slaughter of the brothers, which the sagas recount with a stark, almost numbing matter-of-factness, was the logical, perhaps the inevitable, consequence of the succession arrangement that Harald had devised, an arrangement that had attempted to square the circle of the partible inheritance and the indivisible kingdom, and that had, in the event, satisfied no one, either the High King, who was threatened by the sub-kings, nor the sub-kings, who were threatened by the High King, and that had simply deferred, to the next generation, the bloody reckoning that the Unification had made inescapable. The aristocrats of Norway, the lendermen and the great jarls who had been the pillars of Harald's regime, watched the unfolding carnage with a growing, horrified realization that the king they had served, the king who had broken their ancestors' power and who had taxed their ancestral lands, had, in his final, foolish act of dynastic engineering, created a monster who was now devouring his own kin, a monster who, if he was not stopped, would soon turn his blood axe against the very nobles who were the foundation of the royal power. The resistance to Eirik coalesced around the figure of his youngest half-brother, Hakon, the son of Harald, and a woman named Tora Masterstone, a servant girl from the island of Moster, who had been born late in the old king's life and who had been sent, as a child, to be fostered at the court of the Anglo-Saxon King Athelstan, the grandson of Alfred the Great. A fostering that had removed the boy from the murderous atmosphere of the Norwegian court and that had, in the process, made him a Christian, a speaker of English, and a student of the centralized, bureaucratic monarchy that the West Saxon dynasty had constructed. The news of Eirik's atrocities, carried across the North Sea by the same merchant ships that plied the trade routes between New York and the Norwegian ports, reached the court of Athelstan and the ears of the young Hakon, who, now a handsome, intelligent, and charismatic man in his late teens, began to assemble the fleet and the army that would carry him back to the land of his birth and to the throne that his brothers were destroying. The return of Hakon to Norway, which the sagas date to around 934, was a masterpiece of political theater and diplomatic coordination, a campaign that was, in its combination of foreign military support, domestic aristocratic conspiracy, and the personal charisma of the young pretender, a model of the kind of dynastic coup that would become, in the centuries that followed, the standard mechanism for the resolution of a Norwegian succession crisis. Hakon landed on the coast of Trøndelag, the rich, fertile region around the Trondheimsfjord that was the heartland of the old, pre-Haraldian aristocracy, the region that had been the most stubbornly resistant to the Yngling centralization and that had preserved, in its frost-bathing assembly and its pagan temples, the memory of the independent, thing-based political order that Harald had sought to destroy. The Jarl of Trøndelag, the powerful and ambitious Sigurd Håkonsson, the son of the same Hakon Grjotgardsson who had been one of Harald's most important allies, recognized in the young Hakon an opportunity to rid the kingdom of the hated Eirik and to restore the power of the regional aristocracy, and his support, which brought the Trøndelag fleet and the Trøndelag warriors to Hakon's banner, was the decisive factor in the campaign that followed. Eirik, whose brutality had alienated the very nobles who should have been his natural supporters, found himself abandoned, his army melting away, his fleet outnumbered, and his kingdom slipping from his grasp, and in the autumn of 934, recognizing that his position was hopeless, he gathered his remaining followers, his wife Gunhild, his children, and his portable treasure, and fled into exile, crossing the North Sea to the Orkney Islands and then to the Viking kingdom of York, where he would, for a brief, violent period, rule as the last independent Scandinavian king of Northumbria, a final, bloody chapter in the saga of the Harald Signer that would end, in 954, with his death in battle on the bleak, windswept moor of Steinmoor. The reign of Hakon Haraldsson, who is remembered in the Norse historical tradition as Hakon Alsteinstri, Hakon the foster son of Athelstan, and more enduringly as Hakon G. Hakon the Good, was a reign that, in its deliberate, self-conscious attempt to reconcile the centralizing, state-building project of his father with the traditional liberties and the pagan religion of the Norwegian freeholders, was a pivot point in the history of the Norwegian monarchy, a moment when the kingdom could have swung decisively toward the Anglo-Saxon, Christian, bureaucratic model that Hakon had absorbed at the court of Athelstan, or toward a restoration of the old, thing-based, pagan order, but that, in the event, achieved neither, a failure that was the central, defining tragedy of Hakon's life and that would, in the long run, contribute to the century of civil war that followed his death. Hakon, who was, at the time of his accession, a young man of perhaps 15 or 16 years, had spent his formative years in the most sophisticated Christian court in northern Europe, the court of Athelstan, the first king to style himself King of all Britain. A court that was a center of learning, of legal reform, and of a new, imperial style of Christian kingship that was profoundly different from the traditional, personal, charismatic kingship of the pagan Norse world, and the young Hakon had absorbed, through his education and his observation of the Anglo-Saxon state, a vision of what a monarchy could be, a centralized, law-giving, peacekeeping institution that was backed by the authority of the Christian God and that was administered by a literate, Latin-trained clergy, that was radically at odds with the realities of the Norwegian political landscape. The religious policy of Hakon's reign, which was the most controversial and the most consequential aspect of his rule, was a policy that was, in its initial, cautious phase, a model of political prudence, a recognition that the Norwegian aristocracy, which was overwhelmingly pagan and which had just overthrown a tyrannical king in the name of the old liberties, would not tolerate a king who attempted to impose a foreign religion by force, but that was, in its later, more assertive phase, a policy that overreached, that underestimated the depth of the popular attachment to the old gods, and that provoked a rebellion that, while it did not unseat the king, permanently weakened his authority and prevented the kind of top-down, royal-led conversion that would later, under Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, succeed through a combination of brutal coercion and political calculation. Hakon, who had been baptized and confirmed as a Christian at the court of Athelstan, arrived in Norway with a retinue of English priests and with a set of Christian holy books and liturgical vessels, the material apparatus of the new faith. But he quickly realized, after his initial conversations with the Trøndelag chieftains, that any open, public profession of Christianity would be the end of his kingship. And he adopted, for the first years of his reign, a policy of quiet, private observance. Saying his prayers in the privacy of his hall and refraining from the public sacrifices, the blot, that were the central, communal rituals of the pagan religion. The Trøndelag farmers, who were the most fervently pagan population in the kingdom, were initially suspicious of the young king's refusal to participate in the sacrifices, but they were mollified by his general respect for the old customs and by his willingness to attend the sacrificial feasts, even if he refused to eat the horse meat that was the sacred, central dish of the pagan ritual. The crisis of Hakon's religious policy came to a head at the Great Frostathing Assembly at Mer, the most important pagan cult center in Trøndelag, where the farmers, who had gathered for the annual blot and who were, according to Snorri, angry and suspicious of the king's behavior, confronted Hakon with a stark, unambiguous ultimatum. He must participate, fully and publicly, in the sacrifice, eating the horse meat and drinking the sacred toast to the gods, or he would be driven from the kingdom and a more pious, pagan king would be elected in his place. The scene that Snorri describes, a scene that has all the dramatic intensity and the psychological complexity of a great novel, depicts the young king, surrounded by his loyal but outnumbered retainers, faced with the choice between his faith and his crown, and the compromise that he ultimately accepted, a compromise that was brokered by the Jarl Sigurd Håkonsson, who was, as ever, the mediator between the crown and the farmers, was a compromise that saved his kingship but that, in the eyes of the Christians, damned his soul. Hakon, according to Snorri, agreed to eat a morsel of the horse liver, but he wrapped it in a cloth before placing it in his mouth, a pathetic, half-hearted gesture of defiance that satisfied neither the pagans, who saw it as a mockery of the ritual, nor the Christians, who saw it as a shameful, apostate capitulation to the forces of darkness, and the episode, which is one of the most memorable and the most moving in the entire Heimskringla, is a powerful, tragic symbol of the dilemma that confronted the first generation of Christian kings in the pagan north, a dilemma that could not be resolved by half measures and compromises. The legal and administrative reforms of Hakon's reign, which were, in many ways, the most important and the most enduring aspect of his rule, were a continuation and a refinement of the centralizing project that his father had initiated, a project that Hakon, with his Anglo-Saxon education and his understanding of the bureaucratic, literate state, was uniquely qualified to advance. And the institutions that he created, particularly the Leanger naval levy and the Gyda law code, would be the foundation of the Norwegian state for the remainder of the Middle Ages. The Leanger, which Hakon either created or systematized, was a universal system of military obligation that divided the entire coastline of the kingdom into a series of districts, the Skaprier, each of which was required to provide a fully equipped longship, its crew, and its provisions for a fixed period of service each year, a system that was in its capacity to mobilize the entire military resources of the kingdom in a matter of weeks, a quantum leap in the military power of the Norwegian monarchy, a power that made the king, for the first time, the undisputed master of the sea routes, and that gave him an instrument of force that no regional jarl, however wealthy or ambitious, could hope to match. The Gyda law, which was committed to writing, in the Old Norse language, during Hakon's reign or shortly thereafter, was the first written law code in Norwegian history, a compilation of the ancient, oral customs of the western districts that was, at the same time, a vehicle for the introduction of new, royal legislation, a body of law that was, in its combination of tradition and innovation, the perfect expression of Hakon's political philosophy, a philosophy that sought to build the future on the foundations of the past. The death of Hakon the Good, which occurred at the Battle of Hafrsfjord on the island of Stord in 961, was a death that was, in its heroic, tragic dimensions, the stuff of the greatest saga literature, a death that Snorri, with his genius for the memorable, poignant scene, describes in a passage that is one of the masterpieces of the Heimskringla. The sons of Eirik Bloodaxe, who had been raised in exile at the court of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, who had converted to Christianity himself, and who had, with Danish support, assembled a massive fleet to reclaim their father's throne, landed on the coast of Hordaland in the summer of 961, and Hakon, who was attending a feast at the royal estate of Hafrsfjord, was taken by surprise. His forces scattered, his scouts failing to detect the approaching enemy until the longships were already in the bay. The battle that followed, which was fought on the narrow strip of flat land between the fjord and the mountains, was a desperate, close-quarter engagement, a slaughter in which the king's small, outnumbered force of herd warriors was overwhelmed by the superior numbers of the Eiriksons, and Hakon, who fought, according to Snorri, with a ferocity that was worthy of his father, was struck by an arrow that pierced his arm and that, despite the efforts of his physicians, bled him to death over the course of the following day, a slow, agonizing end that the king, according to the Saga, accepted with the calm, fatalistic courage of the pagan warrior he had, in his heart, perhaps remained. The body of Hakon the Good, the Christian king who had been forced to eat the horse liver, was buried, according to the pagan custom, in a great mound on the island of Stord, and the skaldic poem Hakonarmal, which was composed for the dead king by the poet Eyvind Skaldespiller, imagines his soul being received into Valhalla by Odin himself, a final, ambiguous tribute to a king who had, throughout his life, straddled the boundary between the old world and the new. The reign of the sons of Eirik Blood Axe, the Eiriksonar, who ruled Norway, in a shifting, unstable coalition, from the death of Hakon the Good in 961 to the rise of Olaf Tryggvason in 995, was a period of almost unrelieved chaos, violence, and political disintegration, a period that the sagas depict with a grim, disapproving tone, as a time when the old, centrifugal forces of the Norwegian chieftaincy, which Harald Fairhair had suppressed and which Hakon the Good had attempted to placate, reasserted themselves with a vengeance, reducing the kingdom to a battlefield of competing jarls and rival claimants, a period that, in the memory of the saga writers, was the darkest chapter of Norwegian history, a cautionary tale of the consequences of a weak, divided monarchy. The Eiriksonar, who were the sons of Eirik Blood Axe and his formidable, ambitious, and reputedly sorcerous wife Gunhild, a woman who, in the saga tradition, is the archetype of the evil queen, the manipulative, power-hungry mother who drives her sons to destruction, were, in the judgment of the sagas, cruel, greedy, and incompetent rulers. Men who had inherited their father's brutality without his martial prowess and who lacked, entirely, the political intelligence and the personal charisma that had enabled their grandfather Harald to build a kingdom and their uncle Hakon to preserve it. The sagas recount that the Eiriksonar, under the baleful influence of their mother Gunhild, who was, according to the lurid tales that were told about her, a mistress of the dark arts of seer, the shamanistic magic that was the most feared and the most despised form of sorcery in the Norse world, pursued a policy of systematic oppression, crushing the old aristocracy, extorting the freeholders, and, in a particularly notorious episode, murdering the noble and popular Jarl Sigurd Håkonsson, the son of the man who had been Hakon the Good's most loyal supporter, an act of treachery that turned the Trondelag aristocracy decisively against the new regime. The political structure of Norway under the Eiriksonar, which the sagas describe as a kind of collective tyranny, a rule by a committee of fratricidal brothers who were constantly quarreling among themselves over the division of the spoils, was a structure that was, in its essence, a reversion to the old, pre-Haraldian pattern of fragmented, personal, clan-based rule, a pattern in which the kingdom was not a single, indivisible entity but a piece of family property, a Jarl estate that was to be divided, equally or unequally, among the surviving sons, a reversion that was, in a sense, the inevitable, delayed working out of the contradiction between the partible inheritance and the centralized state that Harald Fairhair had attempted to resolve through the designation of Eirik as Ífirkingur, a resolution that had, in the event, satisfied no one and that had merely postponed, to the next generation, the bloody reckoning. The most powerful and the most dangerous of the Eiriksonar was Harald Greycloak, Harald the Grafalder, who was named for the grey, sheepskin cloak that he wore, a garment that was said to have been given to him by the Sami sorcerers of the far north and that was, according to the whispers of the court, imbued with a protective magic, a magic that, if it existed, proved insufficient to save him from the ambush that the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, who had been his patron and his manipulator, sprang on him in the Limfjord around 970, an ambush that left Harald Greycloak dead, his body dumped in the sea, and the Eiriksonar coalition fatally weakened. The death of Harald Greycloak, which the sagas attribute to the machinations of the same Gunhild who had been the evil genius of the family, was the signal for a new, even more chaotic phase of the Norwegian civil wars, a phase in which the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, who had been the power behind the Eiriksener throne, sought to extend his direct rule over Norway, installing a series of puppet jarls, the Jarl Hakon Sigurdsson, the son of the murdered Sigurd Håkonsson, being the most famous and the most formidable, to govern the kingdom as his vassals, a period of Danish overlordship that was, for the Norwegian aristocracy, a humiliation that was even more galling than the tyranny of the Eiriksener. Hakon Sigurdsson, the Jarl of Lade in Trøndelag, who was, according to the Sagas, a man of immense physical strength, magnetic personal charm, and a deep, sincere devotion to the old pagan gods, was the dominant figure of this period, a Jarl who was, in his power and his independence, a throwback to the great, pre-Haraldian chieftains of the 9th century. A man who ruled Trøndelag and the western districts as his personal domain, who refused to pay tribute to the Danish king, and who, in the great pagan temple at Maer, presided over the sacrifices and the feasts that were the public, ritual expressions of the old religion, a religion that, in Hakon's person, mounted its last, defiant stand against the Christian tide that was rising from the south. The reign of Jarl Hakon, which lasted from the 970s to the arrival of Olaf Tryggvason in 995, was a period of temporary, fragile stability, a period in which the old, pagan, aristocratic order, the order that Harald Fairhair had overthrown, enjoyed a final, Indian summer, a summer that was, in the event, ended not by internal rebellion but by the arrival of a new, messianic, Christian king, a king who would, in a few short years, complete the religious revolution that Hakon the Good had attempted and failed to achieve. The legacy of the Eiriksener period, which the sagas treat as a kind of interregnum, a dark, chaotic age that was the necessary prelude to the dawn of the Christian monarchy, was a legacy that was, in its institutional and political effects, both destructive and paradoxically constructive, because the chaos of the period, the endless, exhausting cycle of raids, battles, and assassinations, created a deep, widespread longing for order, for a strong, centralized monarchy that could restore the peace and the rule of law that Harald Fairhair had, in his time, provided, a longing that the next generation of Christian kings, Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, would exploit to the full, transforming the Norwegian monarchy, in the space of a single generation, from a fragile, contested institution into an absolute, Christian, theocratic state. The Eiriksener, who were, in the saga's judgment, the worst of the Haraldseiner, the most brutal, the most incompetent, and the most unworthy of their grandfather's legacy, were, in this sense, the unwitting architects of their own destruction, the men whose misrule prepared the ground for the revolution that would sweep them and the old, pagan order that they represented into the dustbin of history. The accession of Olaf Tryggvason to the Norwegian throne in the year 995, a date that the saga writers celebrate as the beginning of a new, Christian era, was a revolution that was, in its speed, its violence, and its radical, transformative ambition, a revolution that dwarfed the unification of Harald Fairhair, a revolution that was not merely a change of dynasty but a change of civilization. A deliberate, state-sponsored campaign to extirpate the old, pagan religion, to destroy its temples and its idols, to kill or convert its priests, and to impose, upon a reluctant, deeply traditional population, the new faith of the Christian God, a campaign that was, in its methods, a brutal, coercive exercise of royal power, but that was, in its ultimate, long-term effects, the completion of the centralizing, state-building project that Harald Fairhair had initiated, a project that could not be completed, as the chaos of the Eiriksener period had demonstrated, without the ideological and institutional support of the Christian Church. Olaf Tryggvason, who was the great-grandson of Harald Fairhair through his son Olaf Geirstadath, was, according to the saga tradition, a figure of almost superhuman charisma, a man of immense physical beauty, towering strength, and a ferocious, single-minded zeal that was the product, in part, of his own extraordinary life story, a life story that reads, in the sagas, like a romance, a tale of exile, adventure, slavery, and conversion that made Olaf, in the eyes of his followers, a king who had been chosen by God to bring the light of the gospel to the heathen north. The early life of Olaf Tryggvason, which the sagas recount in vivid, colorful detail, was a life that was shaped, from its earliest moments, by the violence and the chaos of the Norwegian civil wars, a life that began with the murder of his father, Tryggve Olafsson, who was killed by the Eiriksener when Olaf was still in his mother's womb, and that continued, after his birth, with a desperate, perilous flight across the mountains and the fjords, his mother Astrid, her infant son in her arms. Fleeing from the assassins of Gunhild, a flight that ended, eventually, in the slave markets of Estonia, where the young Olaf, a boy of perhaps 9 or 10, was sold into bondage to a local chieftain, a trauma that, according to the Christian saga writers, was the crucible in which his faith and his character were forged. The saga relates that Olaf was eventually recognized, in the market of a Russian town, by an uncle, the warrior Sigurd, who was serving in the retinue of the great Prince Vladimir of Kiev, the ruler of the Rus, the Scandinavian descended elite who governed the river road between the Baltic and the Black Sea, and that the young Olaf, his freedom purchased, his royal identity restored, was raised at the court of Vladimir, where he learned the arts of war and the rudiments of the Christian faith. A faith that he would later embrace, with a convert's passionate, absolute commitment, after a series of adventures that took him across the Viking world, from the Baltic to the British Isles, where he was baptized, according to some accounts, by the great Anglo-Saxon bishop Saint Elfi, and where he married a Christian princess, Gyda, the sister of the Norse Gaelic king Olaf Queren of Dublin, a marriage that gave him the wealth, the connections, and the fleet that he needed to return to Norway and to claim the throne of his ancestors. The conversion campaign that Olaf Tryggvason launched, immediately upon his accession, was a campaign that was, in its methods, a systematic, coercive, and often violent program of forced Christianization, a program that was, in its essence, a continuation of the centralization project by other means, because the Christian religion, with its hierarchical, episcopal structure, its literate, Latin-based culture, and its ideology of the king as the anointed, Christ-like ruler, was a far more effective instrument of royal absolutism than the diffuse, decentralized, and tradition-bound pagan cult could ever be. Olaf, who had learned the arts of statecraft at the court of Vladimir the Great, the prince who had converted the Rus to Orthodox Christianity in 988, understood that the conversion of a nation was not merely a spiritual matter, a question of individual conscience, but a political, military, and administrative operation, an operation that required the king to deploy all the resources of his state. His army, his fleet, his treasury, his legal authority, to break the resistance of the pagan priesthood and to compel the population to accept the new faith, and the saga accounts of his conversion tours, the Kristnibo, the Christian message, that he carried from district to district, are a chronicle of a king who moved through the Norwegian landscape with the authority of an Old Testament prophet, smashing the idols, burning the temples, and offering the local chieftains and the freeholders the stark, unambiguous choice that was the standard, brutal ultimatum of the medieval missionary king: baptism or death. The resistance to Olaf's conversion campaign was concentrated, as it had been in the time of Hakon the Good, in the Trondelag region, the heartland of the old religion and the bastion of the pagan aristocracy, and the sagas recount a particularly dramatic and violent episode at the Frostathing assembly, where the farmers, who had gathered in their thousands, their weapons in their hands, confronted the king and his Christian army with a defiance that was, in its courage and its desperation, a last, heroic stand of the old gods against the new. Olaf, who was, whatever his Christian piety, a master of political theater and psychological manipulation, employed a combination of threats, bribes, and a calculated, theatrical display of his own physical prowess. The saga tells us that he challenged the pagan champion to a wrestling match and that he demonstrated his superiority by shattering the champion's arm with a single, effortless twist, to cow the opposition and to persuade the farmers to accept the baptism that they so clearly loathed. The paganism that Olaf destroyed, the paganism of the great temples at Mer and Lade, the paganism of the horse sacrifice and the ritual feasts, was not, however, extinguished overnight. It retreated into the remote valleys and the isolated farmsteads, into the private, domestic sphere of the home and the family, where it would survive, in a syncretic, half-Christianized form, for generations, a stubborn, residual paganism that the Church, with its patient, persistent work of education and acculturation, would eventually absorb and transform. The death of Olaf Tryggvason, which occurred at the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000, a battle that the sagas present as a cosmic clash of the old order and the new, a battle in which the king, betrayed by his own jarls and outnumbered by a coalition of his enemies, the Danish king Svein Forkbeard, the Swedish king Olaf Skakkanung, and the Norwegian jarl Eirik Håkonsson, fought, with a desperate, suicidal courage, against the overwhelming odds, and in the end, leapt from the deck of his great dragon ship, the Ormrin Langi, the Long Serpent, into the cold, dark waters of the Baltic, was a death that the Christian saga writers could only interpret as a martyrdom, a sacrifice that was the foundation of the Christian kingdom that his successors would build. The body of Olaf Tryggvason was never found, and the legends that soon grew up around his memory, the legends that he had escaped, that he had been rescued by angels, that he would return, one day, to reclaim his throne, are a testament to the enduring, messianic power of his personality and to the deep, ineradicable impression that his brief, violent, and transformative reign had made on the Norwegian imagination. The Olaf who emerges from this history is not the gentle, patient missionary of the later hagiographies but a Viking king, a warrior and a zealot, a man who, in the space of 5 years, dragged the Norwegian people, by force and by fear, into the Christian fold, a feat that was, for good and for ill, the completion of the project that Harald Fairhair had begun. The reign of Olaf Haraldsson, who is known to history as Olafur Helgi, Olaf the Holy, the patron saint of Norway and the eternal king of the Norwegian people, was, in its trajectory from a brutal, Viking warlord to a canonized, miracle-working saint, a reign that was the ultimate, paradoxical fulfillment of the Haraldian project, the moment when the centralizing, state-building ambitions of the Yngling dynasty were fused, permanently and irrevocably, with the ideology and the institutions of the Christian Church, a fusion that created the medieval Norwegian state, a state that was, in its essential character, a Christian, theocratic monarchy, a state in which the king was the anointed, Christ-like ruler, the lawgiver and the judge, the defender of the faith and the protector of the poor, a state that was, in the long run, the inheritance of every Norwegian king who followed, down to the present day. Olaf Haraldsson, who was born around 995, the son of the petty king Harald Grensk and the great-grandson of Harald Fairhair through his son Bjorn Farman, spent his youth, like so many of his generation, as a Viking adventurer, a sea king who raided the coasts of the Baltic, the British Isles, and the Frankish Empire, who amassed a considerable fortune in silver and a considerable reputation in blood, and who around 1014, in the Norman city of Rouen, underwent a profound, life-altering experience, a conversion, or a reconversion, to the Christian faith, an experience that, according to the hagiographers, was the result of a direct, personal encounter with the divine, a vision of Christ that commanded the young warrior to abandon his life of pillage and to return to his homeland to claim the throne and to complete the Christianization of the Norwegian people. The military campaign that Olaf launched in the spring of 1015, a campaign that was, in its combination of foreign military support, dynastic legitimacy, and a new, explicitly Christian, messianic ideology, a model of the kind of royal coup that had become, by the 11th century, the standard mechanism for the resolution of a Norwegian succession crisis, was a campaign that was directed against the rule of the Jarl Svein Håkonsson, the son of the Jarl Eirik Håkonsson, who had been, since the death of Olaf Tryggvason at Svolder, the ruler of Norway as a vassal of the Danish king Knut the Great. Olaf, who had assembled a fleet of some 20 longships and a force of seasoned, battle-hardened warriors, many of them Christians who had been inspired by the young king's zeal and his vision of a holy, unified Norway, landed on the coast of Vestfold, the ancient heartland of the Yngling dynasty, and in a series of rapid, decisive engagements, defeated the local forces of the Jarl, who was captured, forced to swear an oath of exile, and sent, a broken man, to the court of Knut in England. The Battle of Hafrsfjord, which was fought on the waters of the Fjord on Palm Sunday, March 25, 1016, a date that the Christian chroniclers would later celebrate as a providential sign of God's favor, was the decisive engagement of the campaign. A fierce, ship-to-ship battle that pitted Olaf's Christian fleet against the pagan forces of the Jarl Sven, and the victory that Olaf won. A victory that was attributed by the Christian poets to the intercession of Christ and the Virgin Mary. Established the young king as the undisputed master of the eastern and central regions of the kingdom, a mastery that he would, over the next decade, extend, by a combination of military force and political negotiation, to the farthest fjords of the north and the west. The legislative and administrative program of Olaf Haraldsson, which was, in its scope and its ambition, the most radical and the most transformative program of any Norwegian king since Harald Fairhair, was a program that was explicitly, self-consciously designed to create a Christian, centralized, law-based monarchy, a monarchy that was, in its essence, a new, Christian order. An order that was founded on the principles of the gospel and that was enforced by the sword of the king and the sanction of the church, and the laws that Olaf promulgated, which were codified, in the decades after his death, into the Gulathing and Frostathing codes, were a body of legislation that regulated every aspect of the Norwegian society, from the payment of tithes to the punishment of the secret murderer, from the observance of the Sabbath to the prohibition of the pagan sacrifices, a body of law that was, in its fusion of the old, customary, Norse law and the new, universal, canon law of the Roman Church, a unique, hybrid creation, a creation that was, in its essence, the legal expression of the Christian, centralized monarchy that Harald Fairhair had dreamed of. The Christenritter, the Christian law, that Olaf imposed, was a comprehensive, detailed code of ecclesiastical legislation that mandated the baptism of all children, the burial of the dead in consecrated ground, the payment of tithes to the church, and the observance of the Christian fasts and festivals, a code that was, in its effect, a revolution in the daily life of the Norwegian peasant. A revolution that brought the authority of the church, and the surveillance of the king's officials, into the most intimate, personal spheres of the individual's existence. The rebellion that eventually drove Olaf Haraldsson into exile, a rebellion that was led by the very chieftains who had been the beneficiaries of his centralization and who had chafed under his increasingly autocratic, theocratic rule, was a rebellion that was, in its dynamics, a replay of the rebellion that had toppled Eirik Bloodaxe a century earlier, a rebellion that was fueled by the same deep-seated resentment of the royal taxation, the royal officials, and the royal law that had made the Haraldian monarchy, from its inception, a fragile, contested institution, a resentment that was, in the 1020s, compounded by the aggressive, coercive Christianization that Olaf had pursued, a Christianization that had alienated the pagan, traditionalist aristocracy of the Trondelag and the interior, the very regions that had been the most resistant to the Haraldian centralization. The exiled Olaf, who fled, in the winter of 1028, to the court of the Russian Prince Yaroslav the Wise, the ruler of Kiev and Novgorod, a prince who was, like Olaf, a Christian convert and a builder of a centralized, Christian state, spent 2 years in the east, gathering his resources, his allies, and his resolve, and in the summer of 1030 he returned to Norway, at the head of a small, loyal army of his followers, to reclaim his throne, a return that was, in its desperate, almost suicidal audacity, a final, defiant act of royal will, an act that was, in the Christian interpretation, a martyr's journey to his appointed death. The Battle of Stiklestad, which was fought on July 29, 1030 in the valley of Verdal in Trondelag, was the battle that ended the life of Olaf Haraldsson and that began the legend of Saint Olaf, a battle that the sagas and the hagiographies present, in a magnificent, eschatological light, as a cosmic confrontation between the forces of Christ and the forces of the old gods, a battle in which the king, who was, according to the tradition, marked by a solar eclipse that occurred during the engagement, a miraculous darkening of the sun that was interpreted by the Christian chroniclers as a sign of God's grief and anger, was struck down by the combined forces of the pagan chieftains, his body pierced by 3 wounds, a spear in the side, a sword in the neck, and an axe in the knee, a death that was, in its suffering and its physicality, a conscious, deliberate imitation of the crucifixion, a death that was, in the theology of the medieval church, the gateway to eternal life and the foundation of the Norwegian Church. The body of Olaf, which was secretly buried by his loyal followers in a sandy bank on the banks of the river Nidelva, was, according to the miracle stories that began to circulate almost immediately, the source of a stream of healings, visions, and supernatural phenomena. The blind saw, the lame walked, the sick were cured. That convinced the same Norwegian people who had rejected him in life that the king they had killed was, in truth, a saint, a man of God whose intercession was powerful and whose memory was holy, and the translation of his relics, in 1031, to the Church of St. Clement in Nidaros, the city that we now call Trondheim, was the founding act of the cult of Saint Olaf, a cult that would, within a generation, make Nidaros the spiritual heart of Norway, a pilgrimage center that rivaled Compostela and Rome, and that would transform the Viking kingdom of the 9th century into the Christian, medieval nation of the 11th. The consolidation of the Christian Norwegian monarchy under the rule of Olaf Haraldsson's son, Magnus the Good, and his half-brother, Harald Hardrada, in the decades after the Battle of Stiklestad, was the final, definitive phase of the state-building project that Harald Fairhair had initiated, a phase in which the kingdom, which had been, for a century, a fragile, contested entity, was transformed into a stable, institutionalized monarchy, a monarchy that was, by the time of the death of Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, one of the most centralized and most effectively governed kingdoms in Europe, a kingdom whose administrative structure, the Sissel system of royal officials, and whose military organization, the Leanger naval levy, were the direct, institutional descendants of the Wiesler and the Lendermen that Harald Fairhair had established. Magnus the Good, who was the illegitimate son of Olaf Haraldsson and who was born, according to the Saga tradition, in the year of his father's death, was, at the time of his accession in 1035, a boy of 11, a child who had been raised in exile at the court of Yaroslav the Wise, and his return to Norway, which was negotiated by the same chieftains who had driven his father into exile, was a return that was, in its remarkable, rapid acceptance by the Norwegian things, a sign that the Norwegian aristocracy, after a century of civil war, was finally ready to accept the permanent, institutionalized monarchy that Harald Fairhair had created and that Olaf Haraldsson had sanctified. The reign of Magnus, which lasted from 1035 to 1047, was a reign of reconstruction and reconciliation, a period in which the young king, who was remembered in the sagas as a wise, just, and merciful ruler, a king who was given the epithet, the Good, because of his mildness and his generosity, worked to heal the wounds that the civil wars had inflicted on the Norwegian body politic, to rebuild the alliance between the crown and the aristocracy, and to extend the authority of the Norwegian monarchy into the disputed borderlands of Denmark and Sweden. The reign of Harald Hardrada, the half-brother of Olaf Haraldsson and the uncle of Magnus the Good, who ruled Norway from 1047 to 1066, was, in its scope and its ambition, a reign that was the ultimate expression of the Viking Age and simultaneously its final, spectacular sunset, a reign that was dominated by the personality of a king who was, in the judgment of many historians, the most formidable warrior and the most skilled military commander of his generation, a king who had, before his accession, served as a mercenary captain in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors, fighting the Muslims in Sicily and the Bulgars in the Balkans, amassing a vast fortune in gold and a vast experience in the arts of war and statecraft, a king who returned to Norway in 1046, at the head of a fleet of longships and a treasure chest of Byzantine gold, to claim his share of the kingdom that his half-brother had sanctified and his nephew had consolidated. Harald Hardrada, whose nickname Hari means the hard ruler, or the stern in council, was, in his political philosophy, a direct, uncompromising heir of the Haraldian tradition of royal absolutism, a king who believed, with a fierce, unshakable conviction, that the king was the lord of the land, that the law was the king's law, and that the aristocracy, whatever their ancient lineage and their local power, were the king's servants, not his partners, a conviction that brought him into constant, violent conflict with the great jarls and the regional chieftains who had, under Magnus, enjoyed a period of relative leniency and who now found themselves, under the hard ruler, subjected to a renewed, relentless pressure to submit to the crown. The final, fatal campaign of Harald Hardrada, the invasion of England in the summer of 1066, a campaign that was, in its ambition and its scale, a direct, self-conscious emulation of the conquests of the Lothbrok dynasty and the Great Heathen Army, was, in the event, the last great Viking invasion of the British Isles, the final, spectacular act of the Viking Age, a campaign that ended on September 25, 1066, with the annihilation of the Norwegian army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a battle in which Harald Hardrada himself, the last of the great Viking sea kings, was killed, an arrow piercing his throat, his body falling, according to the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, among the heaped corpses of his warriors, and the raven banner, the Landian, the land waster, that had fluttered over so many Viking victories, was captured by the English King Harold Godwin's son and carried, a trophy of the greatest battle of the age, to the court of the West Saxon monarchy. The death of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, which occurred just 3 weeks before the Battle of Hastings, where the Norman Duke William the Conqueror, the descendant of the Viking chieftain Rollo, would defeat and kill Harold Godwin's son and claim the English throne, is, in the grand, tragic narrative of the Viking Age, the symbolic end of the age of the Sea Kings, the moment when the old, pagan, Nordic world, the world of the longships and the berserkers, of the raven banners and the snake pit executions, finally, irrevocably, gave way to the new, Christian, feudal world of the High Middle Ages, a world in which the descendants of the Vikings, the Normans, would rule England and Sicily, and in which the Norwegian kingdom, consolidated and Christianized, would take its place among the Christian monarchies of Europe. The legacy of Harald Hardrada, which is preserved in the grand, elegiac poetry of the Heimskringla and the Morkinskinna, is a legacy that is, in its essential, symbolic meaning, the legacy of the Viking Age itself, a legacy of adventure, ambition, and tragedy, a legacy that is embodied, in its most complete and most moving form, in the figure of Harald Sigurdsson, the warrior king who had fought in every corner of the known world, who had served the emperors of Byzantium and the princes of Russia, who had married a princess of the Rus, who had founded the city of Oslo, who had crushed the rebellion of the Trondelag farmers with a ruthlessness that was worthy of Harald Fairhair, and who had, in the end, died on an English battlefield, fighting for a throne that was not his, a death that was, in its mixture of glory and futility, the perfect, tragic end of the Viking Age. The Norway that Harald Hardrada left behind, the Norway of the late 11th century, was a Norway that was, in its essential institutional and cultural features, the Norway that Harald Fairhair had dreamed of, a united, Christian, centralized kingdom, a kingdom whose king was the lord of the land, whose law was the king's law, and whose church was the king's church, a kingdom that was, at last, at peace, its civil wars ended, its borders secure, its future assured, a kingdom that was, in the long, slow, organic process of its creation, the true, enduring monument of the first, and the greatest, of its kings. The constitutional and legal development of the Norwegian monarchy in the centuries after Harald Fairhair's death, from the 11th through the 13th centuries, was a process that was, in its broad, evolutionary trajectory, a continuation and a refinement of the centralizing, state-building project that the first king had initiated, a process that saw the gradual, contested, and ultimately successful transformation of the Norwegian state from a personal, patrimonial monarchy, in which the kingdom was, in a very real sense, the private property of the king and his dynasty, into a public, institutional monarchy, in which the kingdom was an abstract, legal entity, a residential publica, a commonwealth, that was governed by the king in accordance with a fixed, written law, a law that was, in theory if not always in practice, binding on the king as well as on his subjects. The reign of King Sverre Sigurdsson, the extraordinary, charismatic, and deeply controversial king who ruled Norway from 1177 to 1202, was the pivotal, transformative moment in this constitutional evolution, a reign that was, in its conflict with the Church and its assertion of the royal supremacy over the ecclesiastical hierarchy, a direct, self-conscious continuation of the Haraldian tradition of royal absolutism, a tradition that Sverre, who was, according to his own, perhaps mythical account, the illegitimate son of a Norwegian king and a Faroese peasant woman, defended with a fierce, articulate, and theologically sophisticated polemic that was, in its explicit, legalistic argumentation, a radical departure from the traditional, charismatic style of Norse kingship. The civil wars of the 12th century, the Birkebeiner and the Baglar, the rival factions that contested the Norwegian throne in a series of devastating, fratricidal conflicts that lasted from the 1130s to the 1240s, were, in their structural causes, a continuation of the same succession disputes that had plagued the kingdom since the death of Harald Fairhair, disputes that were rooted in the fundamental, unresolved tension between the old, customary principle of the partible inheritance, and the new, centralizing imperative of a single, indivisible monarchy, a tension that was exacerbated, in the 12th century, by the growing power and the political ambition of the Church, which, in the wake of the Gregorian reform and the investiture controversy, had begun to assert, with increasing confidence and success, its independence from the royal authority and its right to judge the legitimacy of kings. The Birkebeiner, the Birchlegs, who were the followers of King Sverre and who were, according to the hostile account of the church-aligned saga writers, a ragged, desperate band of outlaws and peasants, and the Baglar, the Croziers, who were the party of the church and the aristocracy, fought a war that was, in its ideological dimension, a war between the old, theocratic, Haraldian conception of the king as the supreme, divinely ordained ruler and the new, Gregorian conception of the Church as an independent, universal institution that was superior, in spiritual matters, to the secular power, a war that was, in its ultimate, political outcome, a victory for the monarchy, but a victory that was purchased at a terrible cost in blood, treasure, and the institutional stability of the kingdom. The reign of King Hakon Hakansson, the grandson of Sverre, who ruled from 1217 to 1263, was the period in which the wounds of the civil wars were finally healed and in which the Norwegian monarchy, now fully Christian, fully centralized, and fully integrated into the European state system, reached its apogee, a period of internal peace, external expansion, and a remarkable cultural and literary flowering, a period that saw the composition of the great king's sagas, the Heimskringla of Snorri Sturluson and the Hakanar Saga Hakanarsonar, the sagas that are our primary sources for the history of Harald Fairhair and his successors, a literary production that was, in itself, a political act, a deliberate, state-sponsored construction of a glorious, continuous, and legitimate royal genealogy that linked the reigning monarch to the semi-mythical founder of the kingdom, a genealogy that was, in its function, the ideological charter of the Norwegian monarchy, the narrative that justified the king's power and that bound the Norwegian people together as a single, historical community. The Heimskringla, which Snorri composed in the 1220s, was, in its structure and its themes, a magnificent, sophisticated work of historical literature, a work that was, simultaneously, a celebration of the Norwegian monarchy and a subtle, nuanced, and sometimes critical examination of the nature of power, the tragedy of the royal succession, and the complex, often bloody relationship between the king, the aristocracy, and the people, a work that was, in its essence, the literary monument of the Haraldian state, the narrative that transformed the brutal, pagan warlord of the 9th century into the founding father of the Christian, medieval kingdom. The law reform of King Magnus the Lawmender, Magnus Lagabøter, who ruled from 1263 to 1280, was the final, decisive step in the constitutional evolution of the Norwegian monarchy, a reform that replaced the old, regional law codes, the Gulathing, the Frostathing, the Eidsivathing, the Borgarthing, with a single, unified, national law code, the Landslov, the Land's Law, that was applicable to the entire kingdom, a reform that was, in its scope and its ambition, a legal revolution, a revolution that was, in its essential character, the completion of the project that Harald Fairhair had initiated, a project that had, for 4 centuries, been the central, driving force of Norwegian political history. The Landslov of 1274, which was promulgated with the consent of the Thing assemblies and which was, in its content, a synthesis of the old, customary Norse law and the new, Roman-influenced canon law of the Church, was a comprehensive, systematic code of law that regulated every aspect of the Norwegian society, from the succession to the throne to the inheritance of the óðal land. From the punishment of the thief to the payment of the tithe, a code that was, in its clarity, its rationality, and its humanity, one of the greatest achievements of medieval European jurisprudence, a code that would remain in force, in its essential provisions, until the 17th century and that would, in the centuries that followed, be the foundation of the Norwegian legal tradition. The landslov was, in a very real sense, the final, permanent, institutional legacy of Harald Fairhair, the law that made the Norwegian people a single, legal community, a community that was bound together, from the Hafrsfjord to the Finnmark, by a common, written law, a law that was the king's law but that was, at the same time, the people's law, a law that was, in its fusion of royal authority and popular consent, the perfect expression of the medieval Norwegian constitution. The figure of Harald Fairhair as he appears in the Icelandic sagas, particularly in the Heimskringla of Snorri Sturluson, is a figure who is, in his complexity, his contradictions, and his profound, Shakespearean humanity, a literary creation of the highest order, a character who is, simultaneously, a heroic conqueror, a wise lawgiver, a tragic father, and a symbol of the terrible, destructive power of the royal ambition, a character who is, in his essence, the embodiment of the Viking age itself, an age of transition, of conflict, of creation and destruction, an age that Snorri, writing in the 13th century, could look back upon with a mixture of admiration, nostalgia, and a clear-eyed, Christian understanding of the tragic, pagan darkness that had preceded the light of the gospel. Snorri, who was a politician, a chieftain, and a historian, as well as a literary genius, was, in his treatment of Harald Fairhair, engaged in a delicate, sophisticated act of political and cultural diplomacy, an act that was designed to celebrate the Norwegian monarchy, which was, in the 1220s, the dominant political force in the Icelandic Commonwealth, while, at the same time, preserving the memory and the dignity of the Icelandic ancestors, the men and women who had fled from Harald's tyranny and who had founded the free, kingless society that Snorri himself was a product of. The Harald of the Heimskringla is, therefore, a Janus-faced figure, a king who is, in one aspect, the glorious founder of the Norwegian state, the hero of Hafrsfjord, the father of the law, and in another aspect, the tyrant whose oppression drove the finest of the Norse chieftains into exile, a tyrant whose centralization of power was the necessary precondition for the freedom that the Icelanders had, for 3 centuries, enjoyed, a freedom that was now, in Snorri's own time, being threatened by the very monarchy that Harald had founded. The narrative artistry of the Heimskringla, which is, in its structure, its pacing, and its characterization, a masterpiece of the saga genre, is particularly evident in the early chapters that deal with Harald's youth, his vow, and his unification of Norway, chapters that are, in their conscious, deliberate employment of the folktale motifs of the unpromising hero, the disdainful princess, and the impossible task, a brilliant, literary construction that is designed to transform the brutal historical reality of a Viking conquest into a compelling, morally coherent, and aesthetically satisfying story, a story that would be repeated, in the mead halls and the farmsteads of Iceland, for generations, a story that would, in the centuries that followed, become the foundational narrative of the Norwegian nation. Snorri's account of the Gyda episode, which we have discussed in an earlier chapter, is a classic example of his narrative method, a method that takes a small, perhaps historical, kernel of fact, the rejection of a marriage proposal by a proud princess, and expands it, through the skillful deployment of dialogue, symbolism, and dramatic irony, into the central, catalytic moment of the entire Unification saga, a moment that transforms Harald from a minor, regional king into the destined, irresistible force that would sweep away the old order. The Snorri who emerges from the Heimskringla is not a mere, passive compiler of older traditions but an active, creative historian, a man who selected, arranged, and embellished his material to create a narrative that was, in its structure and its themes, a work of art, a work that was, at the same time, a profound, sophisticated meditation on the nature of history, the uses of power, and the tragedy of the human condition. The Haraldsvi of Orbjörn Hornklofi, which Snorri quotes extensively in the Heimskringla, is the other, essential literary source for the Harald legend, a skaldic poem that is, in its vivid, concrete imagery, its fierce, pagan pride, and its complex, alliterative, metaphor-dense diction, one of the masterpieces of the Viking Age literary canon, a poem that has been, for over a millennium, the primary poetic inspiration for the Norwegian national myth. The poem, which was composed, probably, in the late 9th century, shortly after the Battle of Hafrsfjord, is a praise poem, a drapa, that was designed to celebrate the king's victory and to immortalize his deeds, a poem that is, in its content, a catalogue of the king's achievements, a list of his enemies, a description of his warriors, and a declaration of his supremacy, a poem that was, in its function, the foundation of the Harald cult, the ritual, poetic expression of the king's Heimskringla, his royal luck that was, in the pagan worldview, the source of his power and the guarantee of his victory. The Haraldsvi, which Snorri, writing 3 centuries after its composition, used as a primary, historical source for his narrative, is a problematic, difficult text, a text that is, in its dense, metaphorical language and its complex, poetic conventions, resistant to the easy, literal interpretation that the saga writer, in his desire for a clear, coherent story, often imposed upon it. A resistance that the modern scholar, with the tools of philology and source criticism, must acknowledge and respect, a resistance that reminds us that the historical Harald, the Harald of the 9th century, is a figure who exists, in the end, only in the words of the poets who praised him and the historians who, centuries later, wove those words into the fabric of their narratives. The modern, academic historiography of Harald Fairhair, which we have discussed in an earlier chapter, is a historiography that is, in its essential character, a critical, skeptical response to the saga tradition, a response that was initiated, in the early 20th century, by the Swedish historian Kurt Weibel and that has been refined, over the subsequent decades, by a succession of Scandinavian and Anglophone scholars, a response that has, in its most extreme, skeptical form, questioned the very existence of a single, unifying king named Harald Fairhair, arguing that the figure of the first king of Norway is a later, literary construction, a composite of several, distinct chieftains who were welded together, by the 12th and 13th century Icelandic historians, into a single, heroic figure, a figure who was, in his function, the genealogical linchpin of the Norwegian monarchy, and the ideological charter of the Norwegian state. The Weibelian critique, which is, in its rigorous, source-critical methodology, a powerful and a valuable corrective to the naive, literal reading of the sagas, has been, in the subsequent scholarship, partially accepted and partially rejected, a rejection that is based on the recognition that the contemporary, skaldic poetry, the Haraldsvi and the other fragments of 9th century verse, does, in fact, testify to the existence of a powerful Norwegian king named Harald, a king who won a great victory at Hafrsfjord and who was remembered by his contemporaries as the unifier of the land, a recognition that, while it does not prove the literal truth of the saga narrative, does establish the essential, historical reality of the man and his achievement. The archaeological record of the late 9th and early 10th centuries in Norway, which is the material, physical residue of the Unification period, is a record that has been, in recent decades, dramatically enriched and transformed by a series of spectacular discoveries. The ship burials of Gokstad and Osberg, the royal center at Avaldsnes, the massive, high-status burial at Gjellestad. Discoveries that have provided, for the first time, a solid, material foundation for the saga narratives, a foundation that, while it cannot, by its nature, confirm the specific, personal details of the Harald legend, does confirm the essential, historical reality of the period that the sagas describe, a period of political consolidation, of the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a new, royal elite, and of the transformation of the Norwegian landscape through the construction of the royal estates. The Visler that were the administrative backbone of the Haraldian monarchy. The Gokstad ship, which was excavated in 1880, and the Osberg ship, which was excavated in 1904, are the two most famous and the most spectacular of the Norwegian ship burials, and they are, in their size, their wealth, and their artistic sophistication, the ultimate, material expression of the Viking Age culture that Harald Fairhair sought to control and to direct, a culture that was, at the time of his unification, at the very peak of its vitality and its creative energy, a culture that would, within a century of his death, be transformed by the forces of Christianization and state formation into the medieval culture of the Norwegian kingdom. The Gokstad ship, which was buried, around the year 900, in a great mound on the coast of Vestfold, is the finest, best preserved example of a 9th century longship that has ever been discovered, a magnificent, clinker-built vessel of oak, 76 feet long and 17 feet wide, with a sleek, elegant hull that was capable of carrying a crew of 32 oarsmen and a full complement of warriors across the open ocean, a vessel that was, in its size and its quality, the ship of a king, the flagship of a fleet, the physical embodiment of the maritime power that was the foundation of the Haraldian state. The burial chamber that was constructed amidships, a timber-lined room that contained the skeleton of a tall, powerfully built man, a man who had died, probably in his 60s, of wounds that were inflicted in battle, a deep, slashing cut to the thigh, a crushing blow to the head, was the tomb of a chieftain or a king of the very highest status, a man who was buried with his weapons, his horses, his dogs, and a magnificent, gilded bronze harness bow, a man who was, in the judgment of many historians, the closest that we can come, in the archaeological record, to the historical Harald Fairhair, a man who lived and died in the very period of the unification and who was buried, with the full, pagan ritual, in the heartland of the Yngling dynasty. The Óðal ship, which was buried, around the year 834, some 60 years before the Battle of Hafrsfjord, is, in its artistic and its cultural significance, an even greater treasure than the Gokstad ship, a vessel that was not a warship but a ceremonial, pleasure yacht, a vessel that was intended for the sheltered waters of the fjords, and that was, in the exquisite, elaborate carvings that adorn its stem, its stern, and its interior, a floating work of art, a masterpiece of the Óðal style. The intricate, sinuous, animal interlaced style that is the most distinctive and the most beautiful of the Viking Age decorative arts. The burial chamber of the Óðal ship contained the skeletons of two women, a woman of advanced age, perhaps in her 70s or 80s, who was the primary occupant of the grave, and a younger woman, perhaps a servant or a slave, who had been sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife, a burial that was, in its wealth and its ritual complexity, the tomb of a queen, a drottning, a woman who was, in the judgment of the archaeologists, probably a member of the Yngling dynasty. Perhaps a grandmother or an aunt of Harald Fairhair, a woman whose grave, with its magnificent, carved wooden cart, its finely woven tapestries, and its exotic, imported silks from the Byzantine Empire, is a window into the world of the 9th century Norwegian elite, a world that was, for all its violence and its paganism, a world of great wealth, great beauty, and a profound, sophisticated aesthetic sensibility. The royal centre at Valdsnes, on the island of Karmøy, which is the traditional site of Harald Fairhair's principal residence and the place of his burial, has been the focus of intensive, ongoing archaeological investigation since the 1990s, an investigation that has revealed a complex, multi-phase settlement that was occupied, continuously, from the early Bronze Age through the Viking Age and the Middle Ages, a settlement that was, in the Viking Age, a konungsgård, a royal estate, a complex of halls, storehouses, and boathouses that commanded the strategic entrance to the Karmsund, the narrow channel that was the main shipping route along the western coast, a location that was, in its control of the sea roads, the perfect, material expression of the maritime basis of Harald's power. The excavations at Valdsnes have revealed the foundations of a massive, aisled hall, a building that was, in its dimensions, one of the largest wooden structures of the Viking Age, a hall that was, in all probability, the Hall of the Sagas, the mead hall in which the king feasted his warriors, dispensed his justice, and presided over the sacrifices and the rituals that were the religious and the political heart of his kingdom. A hall that was, in the memory of the saga writers, the center of the Haraldian universe, the place where the young, shock-haired king had sworn his vow, and where the old, fair-haired king had died, surrounded by his grieving sons and his loyal warriors. The Gjellestad ship burial, which was discovered in 2018 by a team of archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar, is the most recent and the most exciting of the archaeological discoveries that bear on the Haraldian period, a discovery that has, in its implications, the potential to transform our understanding of the political geography and the power structure of 9th century Norway. The Gjellestad ship, which is located in a field in the Hafrsfjord region, not far from the ancient Yngling centers of Vestfold, is a massive, Viking Age vessel, a longship that is, in its dimensions, comparable to the Gokstad and the Oseberg ships, and that was buried, in a great mound, with a high-status burial chamber that has not yet been excavated, a burial that is, in all probability, the tomb of a king or a chieftain of the very highest rank, a man who lived and died in the period of the Unification and who was buried, with the full, pagan, ship burial ritual, in the heartland of the Yngling dynasty. The Gjellestad ship, which is currently undergoing excavation and analysis, has the potential to provide, for the first time, a direct, material link to the world of Harald Fairhair, a link that is, for the historian and the archaeologist, a source of intense, almost unbearable, anticipation, a promise that the silent, buried past may, at last, yield up its secrets. The administrative geography of the unified Norwegian kingdom, the network of royal estates, the Vigeler, and the local assembly sites, the things, that Harald Fairhair and his immediate successors established, was a geography that was, in its essential, enduring features, a fusion of the old, pre-Haraldian, regional divisions of the country and the new, centralized, royal infrastructure that was superimposed upon them, a fusion that created the distinctive, hybrid administrative landscape of the medieval Norwegian state, a landscape in which the ancient, tribal territories, the fylki, the folklands, that were the fundamental units of the pre-unification political order, were preserved, in their names and their boundaries, but were reorganized, under the royal administration, into a new, hierarchical system of shires, the Sysler, that were governed by the royal stewards, the Syslemen, who were the direct, institutional descendants of the Armen that Harald had appointed to oversee the Vigeler. The fylki, which number approximately 30 in the medieval sources, were the ancient, tribal divisions of the Norwegian people, the territories of the fylking, the folk army, that were, in the pre-Haraldian period, the independent, self-governing polities of the Norwegian coast, and their survival, in the administrative geography of the unified kingdom, is a testament to the deep, conservative power of the local, regional identity, an identity that the Haraldian monarchy, for all its centralizing ambition, was compelled to recognize and to co-opt, rather than to abolish. The Vigeler, the royal estates that were the nodal points of the Haraldian administrative network, were scattered, in a deliberate, strategic pattern, along the entire length of the Norwegian coast, from the Hafrsfjord to the far north of Hålogaland, a pattern that was designed to ensure that the king, during his constant, peripatetic journeys through the kingdom, would never be more than a day's sail from a secure, well-provisioned base, a base that was, simultaneously, a center of royal consumption, a depot for the collection and the storage of the royal taxes, and a visible, physical symbol of the royal presence, a reminder to the local population that the king's authority extended, without interruption, to the farthest corner of the realm. The Vesla system, which was, in its origin, an adaptation of the old, pre-Haraldian custom of the chieftain's Vesla, the feast that the Hersur was expected to provide for his followers and his guests, was, under the Haraldian monarchy, transformed into a formal, institutionalized system of royal provisioning, a system that required every district, every fylki, to provide a fixed quantity of food, drink, and other supplies to the royal household when the king was in residence, a system that was, in its effect, a form of taxation, a levy that was, in its regularity and its compulsion, a radical departure from the old, voluntary, gift-based economy of the pre-Haraldian chieftaincy. The things, the local, regional, and national assemblies that were the fundamental institutions of the Norse legal and political order, were, under the Haraldian monarchy, both preserved and transformed. Preserved because the king, who was not, in the 9th century, an absolute, Oriental despot, could not govern without the consent and the cooperation of the Thing assemblies, which were the sole legitimate organs of the lawmaking and the dispute settlement that were the essential functions of government, and transformed because the king, through his appointed officials, the Armen and the Lendermen, increasingly dominated the proceedings of the things, controlling the agenda, the outcome, and the enforcement of the assembly's decisions, a transformation that was, in its long-term effect, the conversion of the thing from an independent, popular, self-governing institution into an instrument of the royal will. The Gulating, the great, regional assembly of the western districts, which met at the ancient, sacred site of Gulen on the coast of San, was, under the Haraldian monarchy, the most important of the regional things, a court of appeal, a legislative body, and a royal election assembly, a things that was, in its composition and its procedure, a microcosm of the Norwegian constitution. A body that included the king, the bishops, the jarls, the lendermen, and a large, representative body of the freeholders, the bønder, and that was, in its essence, the arena in which the conflicting interests of the crown, the church, the aristocracy, and the people were negotiated and resolved. The Leanger, the naval levy that was the military backbone of the Haraldian state, was, in its administrative and its geographic organization, a system that was, in its essence, a division of the entire kingdom into a series of coastal districts, the Skyprier, each of which was responsible for the construction, the maintenance, and the manning of a single, fully equipped longship, a system that was, in its capacity to mobilize the entire military resources of the kingdom in a matter of weeks. A quantum leap in the military power of the monarchy, a power that was, in the centuries that followed, the ultimate guarantor of the royal peace and the ultimate instrument of the royal expansion. The Skypria, which was, in its origin, a unit of the local, coastal community, a group of farmers and fishermen who were bound together by their shared responsibility for the ship, was, under the Haraldian monarchy, transformed into an administrative unit, a district that was governed by a royal official and that was assessed for the payment of the Leanger tax, a tax that was, in its effect, a permanent, universal military obligation that was imposed on every free, able-bodied man in the kingdom, an obligation that was, in its compulsion and its permanence, a radical departure from the old, voluntary, seasonal, chieftain-led warband that had been the military instrument of the pre-Haraldian petty kingdoms. The administrative geography of the Haraldian state, which was, in its essential, enduring features, the administrative geography of the medieval Norwegian kingdom, was, in its complexity and its sophistication, a remarkable achievement, a system that was, in its combination of the old, traditional, regional divisions and the new, centralized, royal infrastructure. A system that was capable of extracting the resources, maintaining the order, and mobilizing the military power that were the lifeblood of the medieval state, a system that was, in the judgment of the modern historian, the most important and the most enduring legacy of Harald Fairhair, the institutional foundation of the Norwegian kingdom that would, in the centuries that followed, evolve into the modern, democratic state of Norway. The cultural and ideological construction of the Harald Fairhair myth, which was a process that unfolded, over the course of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, in the pages of the Icelandic Sagas, the Latin chronicles of the Norwegian Church, and the oral, folk traditions of the Norwegian peasantry, was a process that was, in its essence, a work of collective memory, a work that transformed the historical 9th century warlord, whose actual deeds and whose actual character are, and will remain, largely unknown to us, into the founding father of the Norwegian nation, a symbol of the unity, the independence, and the ancient, proud origins of the Norwegian people, a symbol that was, in the centuries that followed, a source of inspiration, of legitimacy, and of national identity, a symbol that was, in the 19th century, during the struggle for Norwegian independence from Sweden, deployed with a deliberate, conscious, and highly effective political purpose by the leaders of the Norwegian national movement. The Harald Fairhair of the national myth, the herald of the 17th of May speeches and the school textbooks, is a figure who is, in his essential, symbolic meaning, the embodiment of the Norwegian nation, a figure who represents, in his person, the values that the modern Norwegians hold most dear, the love of freedom, the resistance to tyranny, the courage to venture across the sea, and the deep, enduring connection to the land and the landscape of the Norwegian homeland, values that are, in their combination, the distinctive, proud heritage of the Norwegian people, a heritage that is, in the national imagination, the direct, unbroken legacy of the Viking Age and of the first great king who united the land. The Saga of Harald Fairhair, which was preserved in the remote, volcanic fastness of Iceland by the descendants of the exiles who had fled from his tyranny, is, in its essence, a complex, ambiguous, and deeply ironic foundation narrative, a narrative that celebrates the birth of the Norwegian nation while, at the same time, memorializing the destruction of the old, free, thing-based order that the Icelandic Commonwealth was a last, isolated remnant of, a narrative that is, in its simultaneous celebration and critique of the royal power, a profound, sophisticated meditation on the nature of political order, the cost of centralization, and the tragedy of the loss of the ancient, aristocratic liberties, a meditation that was, for the 13th century Icelanders, who were, at the time of the saga's composition, in the process of losing their own, cherished independence to the Norwegian crown. A meditation of immediate, painful, and personal relevance. The herald of the sagas is, therefore, a figure who is both a hero and a villain, a founder and a destroyer, a king whose achievements were immense and whose methods were brutal, a king who was, in the complex, nuanced judgment of the saga writers, a necessary evil, a man who had been chosen by fate, by the gods, or by the Christian God, to perform the great, terrible work of unification, a work that was, in the long run, the foundation of the Norwegian nation, but that was, in the short run, a catastrophe for the men and women who lived through it. The early modern reception of the Harald Fairhair myth, which was, in the 16th and 17th centuries, a period of intense, nationalistic antiquarianism in the Scandinavian kingdoms, was a reception that was shaped by the political rivalry between Denmark and Sweden and by the desire of the Danish-Norwegian monarchy to construct a glorious, ancient, and legitimate genealogy that would demonstrate the superiority of the Oldenburg dynasty and its right to rule the north. The Danish historians of the 16th century, such as Saxo Grammaticus, whose Gesta Danorum was, in its printed, Latin editions, a foundational text of the Scandinavian Renaissance, and the Swedish antiquarians, such as Olaus Magnus, celebrated Harald Fairhair as a great Nordic king, a conqueror and a lawgiver, a figure whose achievements were a source of pride for the entire Scandinavian world. A figure who was, in the pan-Scandinavian, nationalist imagination of the period, a symbol of the ancient, Gothic glory that was the common heritage of the Nordic peoples, a glory that was, in the 16th and 17th centuries, being revived by the great, Protestant, militarized monarchies of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The 19th century, romantic nationalist construction of the Harald Fairhair myth, which was the most intense, the most creative, and the most politically consequential phase of the myth-making process, was a construction that was, in its essence, a response to the political crisis of the Napoleonic Wars, the dissolution of the Dano-Norwegian Union, and the union of Norway with Sweden in 1814. A crisis that forced the Norwegian people, who had been, for 4 centuries, a junior partner in the Danish-dominated Oldenburg state, to confront the question of their own, distinct, national identity, a question that the poets, the historians, and the politicians of the Norwegian Romantic movement answered, with a united, passionate voice, by turning to the figure of Harald Fairhair, the founder of the ancient, independent Norwegian kingdom, the symbol of the nation's lost, medieval glory, and the inspiration for its modern, political and cultural revival. The great, Norwegian poets of the 19th century, Henrik Wergeland, who wrote a magnificent, epic poem on the life of Harald Fairhair, and Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, who composed the lyrics of the Norwegian national anthem, Ja 6 elsker det landet, which invokes the memory of the Viking kings, transformed the saga material into a modern, national epic, an epic that celebrated the Norwegian landscape, the Norwegian people, and the Norwegian spirit of independence, an epic that was, in its political effect, a powerful, emotional force that mobilized the Norwegian population in the struggle for the full, independent, democratic sovereignty that was finally achieved in 1905. The Harald Fairhair monument at Hafrsfjord, which was erected in 1872 on the shores of the fjord where the great battle was fought, is a massive, bronze sculpture of the king, his sword raised, his hair flowing in the wind, a monument that is, in its combination of historical reference and modern, romantic, nationalist symbolism, the perfect material expression of the 19th century Harald myth, a monument that has, for a century and a half, been a site of pilgrimage, of celebration, and of national, collective memory, a monument that is, in its silent bronze presence, a permanent, physical reminder to the Norwegian people of the ancient, heroic origins of their nation. The Harald who stands, in bronze, on the shores of Hafrsfjord is not the historical Harald, the ruthless, 9th century warlord. He is the Harald of the national myth, the Harald of the 17th of May, the Harald who represents, in his person, the eternal, indestructible spirit of the Norwegian people, a spirit that, according to the national narrative, has survived every challenge, every oppression, and every period of foreign domination, and that has, in the end, triumphed over all its enemies, a spirit that is, in the national imagination, the true, enduring legacy of the first king of Norway. The comparative perspective on Harald Fairhair and the unification of Norway, which places the Norwegian development in the broader context of the state formation processes that were occurring, simultaneously, across the early medieval West, is a perspective that reveals both the unique, distinctive features of the Norwegian case and the deep, structural similarities that link the Haraldian project to the contemporary projects of the Carolingian, Anglo-Saxon, and Slavic state builders. Similarities that suggest that the unification of Norway was not a random, anomalous event but a local, Scandinavian expression of a general, European pattern of political centralization, a pattern that was driven, across the continent, by the same fundamental pressures: the growth of population, the intensification of trade, the militarization of the aristocracy, and the influence of the Christian, Roman, imperial model of kingship, that were transforming the fragmented, tribal polities of the early Middle Ages into the centralized, territorial kingdoms of the High Middle Ages. The comparison between Harald Fairhair and Charlemagne, the great, Frankish emperor who, in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, conquered the Saxons, the Lombards, and the Avars, and who constructed a vast, continental empire that was, in its administrative structure, its legal system, and its alliance with the Church, the model of the medieval, Christian, imperial monarchy, is a comparison that is, in its similarities and its differences, profoundly illuminating, a comparison that reveals that Harald, in his own, smaller, Scandinavian sphere, was engaged in the same, essential work of political centralization, military conquest, and ideological legitimation that occupied Charlemagne, and that both kings, in their different ways, were the founders of the political orders that would shape the destinies of their respective peoples for a millennium. The comparison between Harald Fairhair and Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex who, in the late 9th century, halted the Viking advance, constructed a network of fortified bays, and laid the foundations of the unified English kingdom, is a comparison that is, in its parallelism, particularly close and particularly instructive, because both kings faced the same, fundamental problem: the defense and the consolidation of a fragmented, vulnerable kingdom in an age of Viking expansion, and both kings responded to that problem with a similar combination of military reform, legal codification, and the construction of a new, centralized administrative infrastructure, an infrastructure that was, in both cases, the foundation of the medieval state. Alfred's system, his fjord reform, and his law code, the Dambok, were the English equivalents of Harold's Viesler, his Lyanger, and his Gyulathing law, and both kings, in their different cultural and political contexts, were the founders of the national monarchies that would, in the centuries that followed, dominate the political history of their respective islands. The crucial difference between the two kings, the difference that would, in the long run, determine the different trajectories of the English and the Norwegian states, was the religious factor. Alfred was a Christian king, the heir of a centuries-old tradition of Christian, Anglo-Saxon kingship, and his state-building project was, from its inception, integrated with the institutions and the ideology of the Christian Church. While Harald was a pagan king, the ruler of a people who were, in the 9th century, still fiercely attached to the old Nordic gods, and his state-building project, for all its military and administrative success, lacked the ideological and the institutional support of the Church, a lack that was, in the generations after his death, one of the main causes of the chronic instability and the civil wars that plagued the Norwegian monarchy until its final, definitive Christianization in the 11th century. The comparison between Harald Fairhair and the contemporary rulers of the Slavic world, the princes of the Piast dynasty in Poland and the Przemyslid dynasty in Bohemia, who, in the 10th century, unified their respective tribal territories, converted their peoples to Christianity, and established the first, centralized, Slavic states, is a comparison that is, in its structural parallelism, the most striking of all, because the Slavic princes, like Harald, were the founders of new, territorial monarchies that were carved out of a fragmented, tribal, pagan landscape, and their state-building projects, like Harald's, involved the same, essential elements of military conquest, the imposition of a new system of taxation and administration, the co-optation or the destruction of the old, tribal aristocracy, and in the crucial, final step that Harald himself was unable to take, the adoption of the Christian religion as the official, ideological foundation of the state. The Piast Prince Mieszko I, who ruled Poland from approximately 960 to 992, and who, in 966, accepted baptism and married a Christian, Czech princess, was, in his achievement, the Slavic Harald Fairhair, the founder of a unified, Polish state, a state that was, in its combination of military power, administrative centralization, and Christian, Roman, ecclesiastical organization, a state that was, in its essential, institutional features, the model that the Norwegian monarchy, in the 11th century, would eventually adopt, a model that was, in the end, the only viable, long-term solution to the problem of political order in the early medieval North. The ultimate, comparative lesson of the Harald Fairhair case, the lesson that emerges from a broad, pan-European survey of the state formation processes of the early Middle Ages, is a lesson about the centrality of the Christian religion to the successful construction of a durable, centralized, territorial monarchy, a centrality that was, in the Norwegian case, demonstrated, in a negative, tragic fashion, by the failure of the pagan, Haraldian state to survive the death of its founder, and that was, in a positive, triumphant fashion, demonstrated by the success of the Christian, Olafian state that was built, in the 11th century, on the ruins of the Haraldian failure. Harald Fairhair, the pagan unifier, was the necessary precursor, the John the Baptist of the Norwegian state, the man who prepared the way, who cleared the ground, who destroyed the old, tribal, pagan order and who created, through his conquests and his administrative innovations, the physical and the institutional infrastructure of the kingdom, but it was the Christian kings, Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, who were the true, successful founders of the medieval Norwegian state, the kings, who supplied the ideological, the religious, and the cultural dimension that the Haraldian project had lacked, and who, in doing so, completed the work that Harald had begun. The Harald who emerges from this comparative history is not a failure but a precursor, a man whose achievements were immense, whose vision was bold, and whose legacy was enduring, a man who was, in his own, limited pagan context, the greatest of the Norwegian kings, the king who gave his people a collective name, a collective identity, and a collective destiny, a king who, in the words of the poet, was the first, the founder, the father of the nation. The long-term demographic and settlement consequences of Harald Fairhair's unification, the great, westward expansion of the Norse people across the North Atlantic that the Sagas attribute, directly and explicitly, to the political pressures that the king's centralization generated, is a subject that has been, in the past few decades, revolutionized by the application of the new, powerful techniques of population genetics, ancient DNA analysis, and isotopic tracing, techniques that have provided, for the first time, a solid, scientific, quantitative basis for the assessment of the scale, the composition, and the impact of the Norse diaspora, a diaspora that was, in its demographic scope, one of the most significant population movements of the early medieval period, a movement that permanently altered the human geography of the North Atlantic and that established, in the remote, empty islands of the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Faroes, and Iceland, new, permanent, Scandinavian populations that would, in the centuries that followed, evolve into the distinct, modern nations of the North Atlantic. The genetic evidence, which has been gathered and analyzed by a series of major, international research projects, including the People of the British Isles Project and the Viking Genome Project, has demonstrated, with a clarity and a precision that were unimaginable to the historians of the previous generation, that the Norse settlement of the North Atlantic was not a trickle of a few scattered elite migrants but a substantial, mass migration of entire families, a movement that carried across the cold, grey waters of the North Atlantic not only the genes but the language, the law, and the culture of the Norwegian homeland, a movement that was, in its demographic and its cultural impact, the most enduring legacy of the Viking Age. The genetic signature of the Norwegian settlers, which is, in its distribution across the North Atlantic, a permanent, biological, and ineradicable record of the diaspora, has been detected through the analysis of the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA of the modern populations, in the Shetland Islands, where the proportion of Scandinavian ancestry is, according to the most recent studies, approximately 44%, an extraordinary figure that indicates that the Norse settlement of the Shetlands was, in effect, a complete population replacement, a genetic sweep that overwhelmed and absorbed the pre-existing Celtic population, a replacement that is, in its scale and its completeness, a material, biological testament to the intensity and the permanence of the Norse colonization of the Atlantic Islands. The Orkney Islands, which were, like the Shetlands, an integral part of the Norse earldom that was established, according to the Saga tradition, by the allies of Harald Fairhair, have a similarly high, though slightly lower, proportion of Scandinavian ancestry, approximately 30%, a figure that reflects the islands' closer proximity to the Scottish mainland and their greater subsequent integration into the Gaelic-speaking, Scottish political and cultural sphere, an integration that was, in the centuries after the Viking Age, a gradual, cumulative process of intermarriage, cultural assimilation, and linguistic shift that diluted, but did not erase, the original, Norse genetic signature. The Faroe Islands, which were, according to the genetic evidence, settled primarily by Norwegian males who took local, Celtic wives, a pattern that is typical of the Viking settlements across the North Atlantic, have a genetic profile that is, in its mixture of Scandinavian and Celtic ancestry, a direct, biological reflection of the historical settlement pattern that the Sagas and the place name evidence record, a pattern in which the initial, predominantly male, Norse settlers intermarried with the local, Celtic women, a process of admixture that created, within a few generations, a new, hybrid, Norse-Celtic population that was, in its culture, its language, and its identity, firmly rooted in the Scandinavian world but that carried, in its genes, the indelible, biological trace of the pre-Norse, Celtic inhabitants of the islands. The Icelandic population, which is, because of its extreme isolation and its small, founding population, a geneticist's paradise, has been the subject of the most intensive, the most detailed, and the most sophisticated genetic analysis, an analysis that has revealed that the Icelandic gene pool is a mixture of approximately 75% Norse, primarily Norwegian, male ancestry and 65% Celtic, primarily Irish and Scottish, female ancestry, a finding that confirms, with a remarkable, scientific precision, the historical, Saga account of the Icelandic landnam, an account that records that the first settlers were predominantly Norwegian men, many of whom had spent time in the Norse colonies of Ireland and the Hebrides, and that they brought with them, as wives and as slaves, a large number of Celtic women, women whose genes, 1,000 years later, are still present, in every Icelander, a permanent, biological memorial of the great, westward migration that Harald Fairhair's Unification set in motion. The genetic legacy of the Norse diaspora, which is, today, an invisible but a permanent biological fact, a fact that is carried, in the DNA, by the millions of people, in the North Atlantic islands and across the globe, who are the descendants of the Norse settlers, is a legacy that is, in its ultimate, historical significance, a testament to the enduring, transformative power of the human migrations that are the fundamental, driving forces of history, the forces that have, across the millennia, populated the continents, created the nations, and shaped the genetic, the linguistic, and the cultural diversity that is the defining characteristic of the human species. The Harald Fairhair who emerges from this genetic history is not the king of the sagas but the unwitting, distant cause of a biological and a demographic transformation, a man whose political decisions, made in the late 9th century in the halls of Vestfold, have had, as their ultimate, unintended consequence, the creation of the modern, North Atlantic populations that are, in their genes, their languages, and their cultures, the living, breathing, enduring legacy of the Viking Age. A legacy that Harald, in his wildest, most ambitious dreams, could never have imagined but that he, through the chain of events that he set in motion, was ultimately responsible for. The symbolic and the ritual dimensions of the Harald Fairhair legend, the elements of the story, the vow of the uncut hair, the rejection by the proud princess, the climactic, sea battle that decided the fate of the nation, that function, in the cultural memory of the Norwegian people, as a kind of foundational, secular, national myth, a myth that is, in its structure, its emotional power, and its ritual, commemorative function, the functional equivalent of the origin myths of the other European nations, the myths of Romulus and Remus in Rome, of King Arthur in Britain, of Charlemagne in France and Germany, myths that serve, in every culture, the essential, psychological purpose of providing a collective, shared narrative of the nation's birth, a narrative that binds the present generation to the past and that gives the nation a sense of its own, unique, and enduring identity. The Harald myth, which was, in its medieval, saga form, a complex, ambiguous, and deeply ironic narrative, was, in the modern, nationalist era, simplified, purified, and transformed into a straightforward, heroic, and uplifting tale, a tale of a young, determined king who, against all odds, united his people and founded the nation, a tale that was, in the 19th and 20th centuries, taught in the schools, recited at the national festivals, and celebrated in the public monuments, a tale that was, in the words of the Norwegian national anthem, Harald, the hero, who gathered the kingdom. The ritual, commemorative function of the Harald myth is performed, today, most visibly and most powerfully, on the 17th of May, the Norwegian Constitution Day, a national holiday that is, in its combination of a formal, official, political commemoration and a popular, festive, carnival-like celebration, a unique, distinctive expression of the Norwegian national identity, an identity that is, in its deepest historical roots, the identity that Harald Fairhair, in the 9th century, was the first to forge. The children's parades, the marching bands, the traditional bunad costumes, the flags that wave from every house and every street, the speeches that invoke the memory of the ancient Viking kings, all of these are the elements of a modern, secular, national ritual that is, in its function, the reenactment and the renewal of the national, collective memory, a ritual that reminds the Norwegian people, every year, of their shared, historical origins and their common, national destiny, a ritual that is, in its essence, the living, contemporary expression of the Harald Fairhair myth, the myth that is, after 1,000 years, still the foundation of the Norwegian self-image. The Harald who is invoked on the 17th of May is not the historical, 9th century king, a figure who is, and will remain, largely unknown to us. He is the herald of the national myth, the symbol of the nation, a symbol that is, in its enduring, emotional power, a testament to the profound, psychological need that all human communities have for a story of their origins. A story that tells them who they are and where they came from. The academic, scholarly deconstruction of the Harald myth, which was initiated, in the early 20th century, by the Weibel School and which has been continued, in the subsequent decades, by a long succession of critical, source-skeptical historians, has, paradoxically, not diminished the power or the relevance of the myth, because the myth operates, in the cultural and the political sphere, on a level that is distinct from, and independent of, the level of academic, historical fact, a level that is, in its essence, a level of meaning, of value, of collective, emotional identity, a level that is not subject to the canons of empirical, historical proof or disproof. The Norwegian people, who are, in general, a highly educated, historically literate population, are perfectly aware that the saga account of Harald Fairhair is a mixture of fact and legend, that the Gyda story is probably a folk tale, that the hair vow is a symbolic, literary motif, and that the historical, 9th century king was a far more brutal, far less romantic figure than the hero of the national myth. But this awareness does not, in any way, diminish their appreciation of, or their affection for, the Harald legend, because the legend is not, for them, a source of historical information but a source of national identity, a story that they have learned, from their earliest childhood, a story that is, for them, as familiar and as cherished as a family heirloom, a story that is, in the words of the Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgaard, the first, great story of our nation, the story that made us who we are. The ultimate, enduring legacy of Harald Fairhair, the legacy that has survived the rise and the fall of the medieval kingdom, the union with Denmark, the union with Sweden, the German occupation, and the transformation of Norway, in the late 20th century, from a poor, peripheral, maritime nation into one of the wealthiest, most prosperous, and most egalitarian societies in the history of the world, is a legacy that is, in its essence, a legacy of unity, of independence, and of a fierce, proud, democratic spirit, a spirit that is, in the Norwegian national imagination, the direct, unbroken inheritance of the Viking age, the spirit of the free, independent Bondi, the farmer warrior who was the backbone of the old, Norse society, the spirit that Harald Fairhair, whatever his methods and whatever his intentions, was the first to forge into a single, national identity. The Harald who is remembered, today, in the streets of Oslo and in the fjords of the West, is not the conqueror of Hafrsfjord but the founder of the Norwegian people, the king who gave the nation its name, its land, and its sense of a common, collective destiny, a king who, in the long, complex, and often tragic history of the Norwegian nation, stands, like a great, ancient, rune-carved stone, as the marker of the beginning, the point of origin, the first, enduring symbol of the Norway that was, and the Norway that is, and the Norway that will be. Our long and magnificent journey through the life, the legends, and the enduring legacy of Harald Fairhair has brought us, at last, to the final, reflective shore, a place of summation and a farewell, where we can, in the quiet, contemplative space of the documentary's closing moments, look back upon the vast, sprawling, and magnificent landscape that we have traversed and attempt to distill, from the complex, contradictory, and often tragic narrative of the first king of Norway, the essential, enduring meaning of his life and his legacy, a meaning that is, in the end, a meaning about the nature of history itself, about the way that the great, transformative events of the past are the product of the actions of individual, flawed, and ambitious human beings, and about the way that those actions, whatever their immediate, violent consequences, can set in motion chains of events that extend across the centuries and across the oceans, to shape the world that we, the distant, unimagined descendants of the Viking Age, inhabit today. The Harald Fairhair who emerges from this documentary is not a simple, one-dimensional figure, a hero or a tyrant, a founder or a destroyer. He is a man of immense, personal ambition, of a fierce, unbreakable will, of a political and a military genius that was, in its ruthless, pragmatic application, the equal of any of the great state builders of the early medieval West, a man whose life was, in its combination of triumph and tragedy, of creation and destruction, of the most soaring, visionary ambition and the most brutal, coercive violence, a microcosm of the Viking Age itself, an age that was, in its essence, an age of transition, of conflict, of the birth of nations from the chaos of the old, tribal, pagan world. The Norway that Harald Fairhair created, the Norway of the Visler and the Lying, of the Gyldething Law and the Frostathing Assembly, was a Norway that was, in its essential, institutional features, the foundation of the medieval Norwegian state, a state that would, in the centuries that followed, be Christianized, centralized, and transformed into a stable, prosperous, and peaceful kingdom, a kingdom that would, in the 13th century, under the lawmender, produced the great national law code. The landslav, that was the final, permanent, legal expression of the Haraldian project, and that would, in the 19th century, be the foundation of the modern, independent, democratic nation of Norway, a nation that, today, 1,000 years after the death of its first king, is, by any measure, one of the most successful, most prosperous, and most admired societies on the face of the earth. A society that is, in its deep, enduring commitment to the values of freedom, equality, and the rule of law. The true, distant, and honorable heir of the ancient, Norse tradition of the Thing, the assembly of free men, a tradition that Harald Fairhair, for all his centralizing ambition, preserved and transmitted to his successors, a tradition that is, in the modern Norwegian parliament, the Storting, the living, institutional embodiment of the democratic, self-governing spirit of the Viking Age. The Iceland that Harald Fairhair unintentionally created, the Iceland of the Landnam and the Alingi, of the Sagas and the Eddas, was an Iceland that was, in its political creativity, its literary brilliance, and its fierce, independent spirit, the most glorious, enduring achievement of the Norse diaspora, a society that preserved, in its remote, volcanic fastness, the language, the laws, and the stories of the old, pagan, pre-Haraldian Norse world, a society that, in the 13th century, produced the great, literary masterpieces, the Heimskringla, the Landnámabók, the Icelandic, that are, today, our primary, indispensable sources for the history and the culture of the Viking Age, the literature that is the foundation of the modern, global fascination with the Vikings, the literature that has, in its pages, kept the memory of Harald Fairhair and his world alive for 1,000 years. The Harald who is the subject of this documentary, the Harald of the Heimskringla and the Haraldsvi, the Harald of the Gyda legend and the Battle of Hafrsfjord, is, in the end, the Harald of the Icelandic Sagas, a character in a story that is, in its literary brilliance and its profound, human wisdom, one of the greatest stories ever told, a story that has been, for a millennium, the primary, enduring monument of the Viking Age, a monument that, unlike the burial mounds and the rune stones, is not a silent, mute artifact of stone and earth but a living, breathing narrative, a narrative that speaks, across the centuries, to every new generation, a narrative that is, in the words of the great, Icelandic novelist Harald Laxness, the eternal, golden book of our people, the book that will never die. If you have been inspired, moved, or enlightened by this journey into the world of Harald Fairhair and the birth of the Norwegian nation, we invite you to become an active, engaged member of the Stories of Our History community, a fellowship of history enthusiasts who are dedicated to the exploration of the true, extraordinary stories that have shaped the world that we live in. Your support, your engagement, and your passion are the fuel that drives this channel. Please take a moment, now, to smash the like button, to subscribe to the channel and to ring the notification bell, so that you will be the first to know when a new documentary is released, to share this video with your friends, your family, and your social media followers, and to leave your thoughts, your questions, and your theories in the comments section below. The story of Harald Fairhair, of the unification of Norway, and of the great Norse diaspora across the North Atlantic, is a story that is far from over, a story that is still being written, every day, by the historians, the archaeologists, and the geneticists who are, through their painstaking, dedicated work, uncovering new, hidden chapters of the past, and your voice, your curiosity, and your passion are a vital, essential part of that ongoing, collective, human endeavor. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.